So Deb, I do see a Read AI meeting notes guest in the waiting room. Good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 p.m. We're going to give one more minute for participants as they are being admitted from the waiting room. So please stand by for about 45 seconds. Thank you all for joining us today. It's June 17th, 1 p.m. And this is Margie Tatro on behalf of the GridWorks team of myself, Kathy Boyce, and Deborah Shields. We're glad to have all of you engaged in the stakeholder process to inform the El Paso Electric Integrated Resource Plan. We're, of course, joined by our team from El Paso Electric and their consultants E3 to help us all understand the results of some modeling efforts. So welcome and thank you for the time that you are taking to participate in this important process. I have one quick administrative announcement. If anyone has an issue, as you know, we are recording these workshops and posting the links to them on the GridWorks website. That serves as official record for these workshops, along with our written summaries that we prepare. We have decided to not allow artificial intelligence note takers in our workshops because we have seen a proliferation of additional reports that get filed or issued or sent out to stakeholders which have not been vetted. And so we have decided to not allow that. If this decision causes you some concern or issue, please contact Deb Shields offline and we can talk with you about it. So thank you for your understanding. Next slide shows what we're up against, or up for, or up to today. Today's workshop really centers on understanding model results. And so in addition to understanding, interpreting, digesting model results, we want to prepare all stakeholders for conversations about the statement of need and the action plan. Those are two pieces of the IRP that stakeholders have specific opportunities to comment on and engage in that conversation. So our agenda today, after welcome, review of our objectives and where we are in the process, we will talk about preparing for the decisions that come in front of the utility as part of the statement of need and the action plan. And also we'll talk a little bit about the metrics that can be used to compare modeling results, and that will help inform the statement of need. In this first segment today, you'll also hear a quick review of the action plan that EPE had in their prior IRP and an update or two on those activities. After that, we'll dig into modeling results. We'll, of course, accommodate questions and have answers from the EPE and E3 team. After a break, we'll continue that discussion. We'll summarize and adjourn by 4 p.m. Our next slide is just a review of our norms for our workshops. Just to remember that we'd ask you to hold your questions until the Q&A session and then use the React button down below in Zoom to raise your virtual hand, and we will call upon you to come off mute and hopefully come onto camera to state your question. Continue to be as respectful as you have been in your comments and give people the benefit of the doubt as we're all working with good intentions, and be conscious of sharing your ideas but leaving time for others. So that's our norm for the workshop. Thank you for considering those. The next slide then reviews this overall process that we're engaged with. And of course, today's workshop is focused on understanding modeling results. But as you know, in our workshops that preceded today, we talked a lot about modeling inputs. We talked about scenario design and sensitivities. We gathered input from stakeholders on what scenarios and sensitivities were of interest to you all. And now today you will see some results and some draft results that will help inform decisions. That's the column on the right, in which the statement of need and action plan result from evaluation of these analyses. So again, this is a very in-depth process. We appreciate those of you who've been patient, engaging from the very beginning, creating a foundation, shared knowledge to this point where we will begin to collectively evaluate and discuss model results. The next slide, please, Deb, shows one of the other things that GridWorks is doing in collaboration with EPE is we're keeping a list of stakeholder inquiries that have occurred that are still being addressed. This is what we're calling our punch list, and the punch list is available under the GridWorks website under Workshop 6. You'll see some items on the left are some open items. One you'll hear more about today were the ELCC values for some of the stakeholder requested demand side resources that have some interdependencies amongst each other and have to be looked at as part of the model. You'll hear some more about that today. We also heard a request to talk about how are the generation needs from today until 2030 going to be met, and you'll see that actually comes up in the action plan discussion. There was a request for EV adoption shapes and charging profiles, which I know the EPE team is working on making those accessible, and gas price forecasting and volatility issues is a topic that EPE and the utility division staff and the PRC are planning to schedule a time to talk in more detail. The items on the right are things that are completed. You have all seen the ELCC values for gas, wind, solar, and storage. They were presented in Workshop 4, and you're going to see a review of those again here today in today's workshop. Also, the EPE team has followed up with a DoD. I don't know if Kyle Smith is on the call yet, but discussions about resiliency and transmission and assets that could be used for the overall EPE system are in discussion between EPE and the DoD. There was a question about the useful life of solar facilities, and that has been responded to the person who asked that question. And then demand side resource programming is been completed. It's those sensitivities and parameters are incorporated in what you will see today. And then finally, load forecast details, which also have been made available on the SharePoint site. If you wish to see the responses to these items on the right, please feel free to go to the punch list and see the EPE response, and in one case, GridWorks clarification of those items. But we wanted to make sure that you know that both GridWorks and EPE are committed to making sure that we've been responsive to stakeholder questions. So that's the last administrative detail. Deb, if you could go please to the next slide. Today we're going to talk about the Statement of Need and Action Plan, and we've sent to you all a background document to describe the language in the statutory requirement for the IRPs and what they are supposed to include. So you have that language in your read ahead. It's also loaded on our website. And we provided links to 2 other IRPs that have been completed in New Mexico in 2023 under this new IRP rule. So if you want to see examples of statements of need and action plans, you can use those documents for inspiration, especially on action plan. But the statement of need, and Emmanuel will go into this in some more detail in his presentation, but the statement of need includes what resources EPE will need to reliably meet the customer demands and state policies. It should take a broad view of the evolving needs of the system and ensures that a future grid is cost-effective, resilient, and meets state policies. So that's the generic description. There are more details in the law, the rule itself. And the action plan is really a 3-year specific list of things the utility can do to begin implementing their resource plan. It can include actions for new generation. It is likely to do that. And in the current rule, also the utility provides a status report from prior action plan lists. And so that's why you'll see we're starting today with some discussion about what actions have been taken and were underway since EPE filed their prior IRP in 2021. So this is an important part of the stakeholder contribution to the process, and we wanted to make sure you had this in mind as you listen to the modeling results, because the modeling results will inform conversations about these two pieces of the plan. Deb, if you go to the next slide, please. Before we turn over the podium to El Paso Electric, Deb, will you please put in the chat a link to the presentation that EPE will be making today? These presentation materials are loaded onto the GridWorks website under this workshop material. We realize that it's not material that you've been able to see prior to today, so we're going to allow ample time for questions and answers during these presentations. And if need be, we can offer some follow-up office hour type sessions to answer questions that come up as you digest this material after this workshop. So with that, let me ask Emmanuel to have his team share the El Paso Electric slides, and I'll turn the podium and microphone over to you, Emmanuel.
Well, thank you very much, Margie. E3, everybody, thank you for attending. Welcome to our next stakeholder meeting number 6. So this up here is just the agenda. It's everything that we just spoke about, what we're going to be covering in today's meeting. Next slide. This is our safe harbor statement. It's the same statement you've seen over and over again in all the previous presentations. Now, this is the slide that by now I think everybody has become very familiar with, because we've been shoving it at you for several meetings now. We are at workshop number 6, so we are dead in the thick of it. We're right in the middle of it. Before we move on though, I want to give a very public shout out to our analysts and Ben and his team at E3. They have not had a weekend off for a couple of months now. I don't think people really appreciate the amount of work and specialized training that goes into running these models. But we thank everybody for trying to get this out for us in a timely manner. So thank you all. Today, workshop number 6, the meat and potatoes of today is going to be modeling results. It's what everybody's here to see, and that's what we're going to be discussing. And then again, we're going to be moving on in the later meetings to building our statement of need and our action plan and all that good stuff. We do know that there's going to be a lot of information thrown at you all today, so we are going to be coordinating with with GridWorks to add a couple of more office hours. Hopefully we can squeeze some in between now and workshop 7, and then another one again between workshop 7 and 8, just so we can address everybody's questions and whatever other details they need explain further. Next slide. Before we move on, just as for information, EPE has filed for a variance from the current IRP rule. We have Dave Hawkins with us here. If there's anything you want to add, Dave?
No, just that obviously we have load increasing in both our New Mexico and Texas jurisdictions. You've probably seen in previous meetings here, our needs coming up. So we will be needing to issue a request for proposals for both jurisdictions is where we need load, but we sought a variance with the New Mexico Commission to allow us to conduct a need or seek resources for New Mexico with the timing concurrent with our Texas, and hopefully there's economic benefits to both jurisdictions in conducting these together. We're going to work with E3 in doing this. The bids that on the timeline, although we haven't issued it yet, but I would tell you that the bids for the RFP would be after EPE files its IRP with the commission. So we would have a good idea of what the results that are being presented to the commission look like and what we could be looking for in an RFP process. Obviously, we're waiting to hear what the commission would say on this matter, but we just wanted to present that to you now.
Thank you, Dave. So up here on the screen, you see the outline of our 2021 IRP 4-year action plan. Really, the reason that we're sharing this here is because I want everybody to start to, I know you're going to be focused on the results that you're going to be seeing today, but I want you to keep everything focused in the context of what you're going to be seeing over the next couple of hours, trying to keep that mindset as to what these results will eventually lead into us creating a statement of need and then eventually creating the action plan. So just kind of keep everything focused in that direction. Next slide. Here, as stated in the new rule, this is the outline of what our statement of need is going to be, the requirements that are going to have to go into it, what's going to need to be included, types of resources, state policies, all that good stuff. It's not going to be based, as it says there, just on our peak load, but it's going to be including load growth, again, state policies, renewable energy, customer programs. Next slide. And same here, we're just introducing what the action plan needs to include. And again, going back to what I was just saying is try to keep all of our modeling results and all the scenarios and things that we're building in the conversations is ultimately going to lead to us detailing what our statement of need, what our action plan is actually going to be. It's going to be a 3-year period this time around. We're going to try to create the specific actions that are going to go into developing the action plan. That's going to include, like Dave mentioned, resource solicitation, contracting, and of course, waiting that all this gets accepted by the commission. This section here, what we wanted to do was give you all again, a little bit of context as to what it is that EPE will be coming at this statement of need from. As you know, we are a regulated utility, so we do have an obligation to serve all of our customers. You know, the goal is always to have safe, reliable, affordable service. So that is the main focus or driver behind EPE's work here. Add on to that base need or focus that EPE has, you'll start to see the challenges that we face, like our RPS standards and just trying to abide by multi-jurisdictional utilities requirements. Again, like I said, affordability is going to be huge. We do know that we are always conscious of what is going to be most affordable for the customers. And again, the base of our modeling is always to get what is the least cost portfolio of resources for customers. We will also be addressing everything that's going into our load growth. And these are all things that we've been speaking to you all about in the last several stakeholder meetings. We've talked about electrification. We've talked about the potential for large load customers coming into New Mexico and Texas. We've talked about different economic development plans, DER solutions. So all of that we've been discussing and working with you all on, all of that is going to be considered and incorporated into the statement of need. Same goes for the planning horizon. We've talked to you all about that a couple times already. What we show as our immediate need, the next, 1 to 3 years, and then that intermediate need, and then eventually your 10-year plus on the long-term planning. So all of that is reflected in our modeling efforts. It's reflected in our LNR documents, and it's what's going to be addressed in our statement of need. As we've talked about in the past, we are trying to do things a little differently now, transitioning away from your traditional IRP to do more of an ISP. Again, this is something that we've mentioned a couple of times that we know is going to be a multi-year process, transitioning fully from IRP to ISP and implementing all of those transmission, distribution, level of granularity into the model. It takes some time, and it's going to take a lot of work with stakeholders and subject matter experts, but we will be addressing that EPE is starting that move towards an ISP, which we think is where the industry standard, I think, is going to be. So we're trying to get ahead of that and really try to make this process more comprehensive and inclusive. Go to the next slide. Again, for here, these are just topics that we want everybody to keep in mind as we are developing the action plan. You will be seeing a lot of these questions start to be addressed and answered as to what resource needs are going to be, what time frame we can see them developing, or when we're going to need what and by when. Again, everything's going to require commission approval. We have to keep in mind the REA and our RPS standards. We have been working with a group within the stakeholder process that's focused on their want to explore demand side resources more. That is something that we have been looking at for quite some time to try to include into EP's resource portfolio. So it's the most affordable way that we could do that. We have mentioned in January, we made our announcement that we were going to be joining SPP Markets Plus. We have been open about that. We will be addressing part of that within the action plan if anything needs to be addressed through there. The action plan will also include or address and the immediate term for whenever you see a shortfall, if that's going to require the extension of existing units or retirement thereof. So all of these different factors are going to be addressed in one way or another as we're developing our action plan and the statement of need. And now we're going to get into what we all came to see. We're going to pass that over to Ben and E3 and their team.
And
Hey,
before we do this, Ben, we've a lot, and especially I know Dave's time is short. We've got 10 minutes to, roughly 10 minutes to address any questions that stakeholders have on the information presented thus far, Emmanuel. So let's pause, Ben, you coming to do your presentation. Let's please ask stakeholders. If you have a question or comment that you would like to make, please use the react button to raise your hand, and we will call upon you. Kathy will help me watch for hands raised. In particular, we want to be sure that if people have questions about why the statement of need or action plan are important and what we're trying to do, please ask them at this point, because then we're going to shift gears into digesting numbers.
So I see a hand from Randy. Go ahead, Randy.
Just a real quick question, and this is my first time through one of these processes. But El Paso Electric is issuing a RFP for new CT construction. Um, I kind of envision that as being a response to the action plan, but maybe I don't understand. Maybe that's to get cost at this point. So just a question on that, how that falls within the process.
And oh, sorry, be off mute. If I understand the question, your understanding is the RFP would be a result of the action plan determined in the ISP, and what is the purpose of issuing an RFP prior to that? So that's the variance that we're seeking with the commission, but we definitely have a need for resources in Texas as well as New Mexico. Texas does not require the action plan as will be determined in the ISP. There'll be obviously it's a different timeline as we wait for commission approval of the IRP. Texas, like I said, doesn't have that same process. So in order to get resources online for Texas, and we're hopeful for New Mexico, we were issuing it in July, and then there's a period by which those who want to participate, whether it's demand side resources or supply side resources, can evaluate their own options and look at our needs. And we're hopeful that by having our action plan filed concurrently as bids are coming in or before bids are coming in, we'll be able to move that process quickly for New Mexico as well as Texas. But regardless of what New Mexico does, we will have to conduct this RFP for Texas needs, just so we can move faster because of our load requirements there. I hope that was what your question was, Randy.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
So in a similar in the chat here from Steve Fishman, EPE's filed this variance from the IRP rules to issue an RFP for potential data center and customer needs in the next couple months. How will this impact the IRP?
I'll start, and if Ben, if I miss anything, let me know. Ben, E3 has been working with us. E3 will help us in the RFP process. So what you're looking at and what you're going through in the ISP IRP process will produce results of need for New Mexico as well as our system. In the RFP, we are looking for those loads identified in this ISP case. And we're also looking for potential resources for loads that may want to come to the area, wondering when resources can be brought online and what type of resources are available. So it's almost a two-part need in the RFP process. I think the short of it is, you know, the RFP and the information needed to submit proposals will go out prior to the results of the ISP, but particularly in Texas, we'll be seeking all source RFP for which would cover New Mexico as well as Texas on demand side and supply side. And we will have the actual results, as I said, of the ISP prior to even receiving bids, but we can take into account this ISP process as we're evaluating those bids that come into the RFP.
Can you hear me? This is Steve.
Yes, go ahead, Steve.
Okay, great. So the filing asks for a variance from IRP rules. And I understand where EPE is coming from on this. They want to get some information earlier. But the initial request is pretty broad for both system growth and for potential data center loads going forward. And the request for a variance basically sounds as broad as an exemption from the current IRP rules. And I know the commission has asked for some more input on that. I'll be sending it, but I think it'd be great if we could have a discussion with you guys about what's going on with the IRP and maybe discuss what portions of the current IRP rule might still apply, it might be useful to still apply, and what portions of it might not be useful and would be getting in the way and slowing things down. So I think it'd be terrific if EPE would be willing to initiate a discussion with interested IRP stakeholders on what might be the right balance.
So Steve, let me interject here that it's an interesting idea, and of course the current rule requires and allows and encourages stakeholder engagement in the statement of need and action plan, not necessarily the procurement cycle that occurs after. But of course, I know one of the commission's objectives in this new rule is tie planning to going to mark this through the RFP process together. So let's not try to tackle this today unless Dave and Emmanuel want to add a comment. And we will record your interest, Steve, in that discussion. And it is possible that the current variance there, I don't know if there's going to be any opportunity for comment on that outside of this stakeholder process. So we'll have to wait for that determination by the commission. But let me ask Dave and Emmanuel if you wanted to add anything while we record and document your interests, Steve.
Okay. And, again, I'm recognizing the commission's decision will control, but I just want to throw out, maybe here's an opportunity for some collaboration that might be reflected in the action plan as well.
Gotcha. Okay. Good. Dave,
Yeah, thank you, Margie, and thank you, Steve, Commissioner, former Commissioner. That's how I last addressed you, so I stumbled there. But no, I think that, I mean, obviously, if this could be collaborative, it would be better for everyone, is my belief. And if there's a way to get questions answered prior to, or is it June 27th, I think, if there's a way to do that, I myself would be interested in trying to figure out a way to do that, that there could either be support, and if people will have their own positions, I understand that, but if better understanding leads to support, I think that would be a good thing.
Okay. Yeah, no one's forced to do anything on this. It's just if we want to clear the air, that's all.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And I see there's a question. Carol Lynch, would you please come off mute and expand on your question?
Well, I just was following up on Steve Fishman's point about the filing of a variance. And Steve, maybe you can answer, or EPE, was the variance written using the language potential or not?
Believe we have our New Mexico Council on the call, Nancy Burns. Nancy, you care to share some light on our write-up there?
Yeah, hi, Kara. I can send you a copy of the motion. I didn't understand your question.
Well, I was just wondering if the term potential was used, if it's an RFP for potential data center and customer needs.
Yeah, I'm not certain. I have to go back and look at it, but I can send it to you.
Okay. And I was just wondering what potential meant in that context.
Yeah.
If so.
We'll be filing supplemental information that the commission requested. I think it's today. We've reported to the commission that we've had several inquiries from different customers. I can send it to you. It's actually a motion for determination that the IRP rule does not apply, since this is our first IRP cycle and we have the need now, or alternatively for variance. But I don't want to get hyper technical here on that. And so
okay.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Nancy, for following up directly with Kara. Any other questions about statement of need? I don't want to get focused on this RFP process because that's not really, I mean, it is important. And, but are there any questions about the statement of need, about what kinds of things would go into the action plan? If not, we will turn it back over to EPE to start talking about base case modeling results. Kathy, I don't see any other hands raised. Do you?
Nope, I do not. Thank
Okay.
you.
Ben, please proceed.
Excellent, thank you very much. Margie, I think it may be
Margie?
easier if I take over sharing the screen just so I can jump back and forth. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's great. I don't know who's got the share at this point. But yes, you should be able to, Ben.
Ben, Margie, really quick, I just
Yes.
wanted to point out that everything that we spoke about right now on the statement of need, action plan slides that we have, those were not our current plans for the action plan. It's just examples to get people's thought process going.
Yeah, perfect. And we are going to embark on a process toward the end of this workshop to ask people to start thinking about their ideas for action plans. I'm glad you put some food for thought to stimulate the brain. And we'll get back to that later in today's workshop. Thanks, Emmanuel.
Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen real quickly.
Sorry, Margie, while Ben's doing that, and finding his screen, did you guys say that you're posting the filing for the variance to this, or?
Chris, we have not, but all parties who are part of a prior IRP should have been on the service list. We can certainly direct people where to go find that. So yeah, we'll take that as an action, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay, Margie, can you just confirm you can see my screen?
Yes, yes, Ben, we can see your, I think it's your screen. Yes.
Yeah,
you can see,
wonderful.
Yep.
And then Margie, just to confirm, I'm sharing on full screen, so I cannot see anyone's hands being raised
Okay.
or questions in the chat, so feel free to interrupt me whenever needed.
Yep, we'll take care of that, Ben.
Okay, wonderful. So let's start maybe with somewhat of a recap from the last meeting with some additional information here and start looking at these base modeling results once more. So again, just maybe to level set everyone on the phone here, base modeling results really incorporates two phases. The first phase is to conduct the least cost portfolio planning. Now, as we've mentioned before, New Mexico and, EPE serve both New Mexico and Texas. And as we conduct modeling, we essentially do it on a system-wide basis. We do modeling for both Texas and New Mexico. And then we have a very, very complex allocation formula process to then allocate resources across the two jurisdictions. So the first kind of phase in our base modeling is to calculate the least cost. So when calculating the least cost, we ignore any state-specific requirements. And we just say, for example, if the New Mexico renewable portfolio standards did not exist, what would the model choose? And that's what we see kind of here on the left-hand side, this non-compliant portfolio that identifies the least cost. And the modeling that we have done today is based on existing commercially mature technologies. And that essentially is solar, 4 and 8 hour lithium ion storage, wind, geothermal. And also on here on the left-hand side should be natural gas fired CTs. On the right-hand side represents the second phase in our modeling. So what we do is we go through the modeling results from the least cost and we allocate Texas its portion of resources and we lock those resources in. And then we respin the model with just the remaining New Mexico portion of the load and we have it solved to meet the renewable portfolio standards. And during this phase, we do not allow any new gas. So we still have the solar, the 4 and 8 hour lithium ion storage, still have the wind, the geothermal, but no new natural gas. So it's very important to know, I think we kind of maybe got held up on this during the last meeting, that in these base case modeling results, which are essentially two phases, when we look at the least cost that complies with the REA, we do not have any new gas being added to meet New Mexico retail load. Now, the grayed out boxes here are the future scenarios and sensitivities that we will present in the next stakeholder meeting. We will not be presenting them today. We actually concentrated our modeling efforts on the stakeholder requests. So the scenarios and sensitivities I'll be talking about momentarily are all of the stakeholder requested scenarios. But when we come to look at the emerging technologies, we're going to look at things like multi-day energy storage, so 100-hour storage. And we're also going to potentially be looking at gas generation that has a future compliance with the RPS. In other words, it would be carbon-free gas in the future. Now, that would just be the one scenario. I want to make it clear that's not embedded within our base case. And just as I go to the next slide here, I've had some stakeholder feedback since our last meeting. I just want to clarify maybe just a couple of points. And Margie has told me not to get into this, so I'm going to try and stay on track. But just very quickly, this chart here was presented in the 4th meeting. This shows the cost for 4 and 8 hour storage. It shows the cost for CTs and CCs. These do not include any additional costs to become carbon free. So they do not include the equipment to become carbon capture, nor do they include any equipment infrastructure for hydrogen blending. However, that is not the cost that we will be modeling for the New Mexico kind of retail sales here. You'll also see on this chart, we have 2 additional technologies. One right now represents the cost of CCs, including carbon capture. The other includes long duration, multi-duration, 100-hour storage. So when we come to solve the New Mexico piece, we'll actually be using these higher cost assumptions, not these kind of bare gas costs. Looking forward to discussing that in more detail in the next meeting, but just kind of wanted to get ahead of that just real quickly now. And then here, if we look at this kind of flow diagram, this is really just explaining that phase process, that 2-phase process that I just described. First, solving for the least cost portfolio, assigning the resources to Texas, reopening up the New Mexico portion of the demand need, and then resolving compliant with the RPS. So just to shift gears here, just real quickly, here is EP's loads and resources table. So this kind of bottom line here on a system-wide basis is essentially what we're trying to solve to in terms of capacity. I've put a footnote just at the bottom here. EP do continuously kind of QA, QC, do updates and additions to kind of the loads and resources table. So just flagging that this is slightly different to the loads and resources table presented in the last meeting, but just to give everyone some level of comfort here, the change is less than a 10 megawatt difference in every calendar year. So essentially, it's the same kind of loads and resources table as you guys have already seen. I'm not going to go into kind of the discussion that was just had on the potential for kind of an RFP this year, but as we look at the timeline that we're following for this IRP, what we're assuming is all new resources can come in 2030 or later. So in our modeling, we are not solving the solution in 26 through 29, because quite frankly, we do not believe that timeline is feasible if you follow the rules as currently proposed in 17.73. Now, the one exception to that rule will be the demand side solution case, where we actually have new resources coming online as early as 2026 on a transition build, and we'll get into that in more detail later. So again, this is just showing everybody the least cost case from the last meeting on the left here. So again, this is just phase 1 of 2 phases of modeling. So this is solving to the system, ignoring any state-specific requirements. And as you'll see, kind of in that modeling approach, essentially added mostly gas generation, or exclusively gas generation 2030, some additional gas in 2035, and starting to see some wind come into the system. And then as you get out into the latter years, you start seeing a more diverse portfolio. You start seeing some storage and solar coming into the mix. On the right-hand side is the updated modeling results. So as I said, since the last meeting, EP's gone through, they've made some very minor tweaks, alterations to the loads and resources table, to some other modeling inputs and assumptions. But by and large, these results are what I would call exactly the same. Yes, there are some very slight differences sort of here and here, but overall, these results are very much in keeping. So the results stay constant from the last meeting to today's meeting. And then if we look now at the New Mexico position, so this is just the New Mexico portion of EP's entire service territory. Again, loads and resources table that was presented to you in the fifth meeting has been updated. Again, these numbers are pretty close. I think the biggest change was out in 2030, where the resource need has changed by 28 megawatts. So we're still tracking pretty closely. There's just been some updates and corrections here. Just reminding people, if you send in kind of questions to Margie, or you cite these presentation materials in terms of comments or in terms of questions, we will continue to QA/QC, and these numbers may change. So please ensure you use the latest presentation when referencing kind of capacity needs or any other numbers.
Hey, Ben, can you keep that note at the bottom of the screen so we can see the rest of the slide?
Oh, are you still seeing this, Chris? How's that?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. I never know, Chris, what you can actually see and what I can see.
You click on the hide one, it goes away.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, and then also you see kind of just this note here, in all of the cases, with the exception of the emerging technology case that we have not run yet, you cannot build new gas generation to meet this capacity need. Okay, so now this was a request. I believe, Cynthia, you requested this information in the last meeting. This is just looking at the New Mexico build. So in the last meeting, we presented kind of the system-wide data. This is just isolating the New Mexico piece of the least cost plus REA compliant portfolio. So what you'll see here is in 2030, you'll see just shy of 200 megawatts of solar being added in New Mexico. Significant increase by 2035, going up to a total of 710 megawatts in total, and then up to 1,000 megawatts by 2045. So you see this here on these yellow bars. What you also see is a significant addition of battery energy storage almost immediately. So as soon as the model is given the opportunity to build new resources, it goes ahead and it builds a lot of battery energy storage. And then you can see there's kind of some small additions of wind over the kind of the 20-year planning horizon. And this really tracks what we've seen in the past for Paso Electric, right? You know, on the very, southern tip here, not particularly good access to wind generation, but ample access to fantastic solar generation. And as you increase solar penetration, you often see additional batteries being added. So if we now look at this from a nameplate perspective, which is this top box, and we go down into an accredited capacity basis, accredited capacity could be used interchangeably with ELCC. So this is the effective load carrying capability. We can see here that we have approximately 37 megawatts of accredited solar coming from the 189 megawatts of nameplate solar being added. So someone can keep me honest here if they have a calculator, but that's just shy of 20%, maybe 19, 18% sort of range for your accredited capacity of solar. You can see kind of storage here, 4-hour lithium-ion battery energy storage has an ELCC somewhere south of, what's that, maybe 40%. And then wind generation, even though this number is small, it's 2 megawatts, right? On an actual percentage basis, it's pretty large. So it's 50-ish%. And that represents the fact that right now, EP doesn't have much wind on its system. So the value of this initial tranche of wind from a capacity perspective is actually pretty high. Now, if you've participated in other IRPs, other resource planning practices in the past, this is kind of counterintuitive, right? Most of the time you see solar having a high ELCC value, wind having a low ELCC value, but this is just because of the penetration levels that EPE currently has on the system. It has a lot of solar on the system, it has very little wind on the system. So what you're seeing here is solar is already at a point where it has pretty diminished capacity value, and wind is kind of on that starting point of the curve, has very high capacity value. And I do want to just kind of highlight to everyone's attention, because these numbers will change, that we do have a slight issue here. It's not one that I feel is critical enough to kind of not present modeling results today, but in an ideal world, this need that's coming from the loads and resources table would actually match the accredited capacity that is being provided by these resource types. At the moment, we actually see New Mexico has an overbuild of capacity and Texas has an underbuild capacity. And this goes back to kind of my earlier statement where we solve the system as a whole. We then try and allocate the resources across jurisdictions. Unfortunately, that's extremely challenging because some of these factors or some of these inputs and assumptions are kind of related to one another. So as New Mexico builds more solar generation, potentially the value of solar in Texas decreases. So there's this interdependency between the two jurisdictions. We are going to work on solving this. I think the bottom line, just if everyone just keep this in mind, this build of batteries here in New Mexico is probably slightly overstated, and some of this really should be going across to Texas. It's, in the region of 50 sort of megawatts is my expectation. And now just going back to kind of a slide that we presented in the 4th stakeholder meeting, I believe. This is looking at the ELCC values for solar and the ELCC values for 4-hour lithium-ion storage. So right now, because of the high penetrations of solar already on the system, the incremental value of solar from a capacity perspective is down and around that 19%. It's exactly what we see, going back one slide here, is this accredited capacity is approximately 19%. Now keep in mind, this is an incremental value. This is not system average. The system average would be higher. And then as we look at 4-hour lithium-ion storage, we see about 46%. We're probably in the slide before just starting to get up maybe to this kind of new level because of that extra 700 megawatts. So what this is essentially saying is for every 1 megawatt of accredited capacity that you need, all else being equal, if you were to fulfill that need with storage, you would need about 2 megawatts of nameplate 4-hour lithium-ion storage, or you would need 5 megawatts of nameplate solar generation to get 1 megawatt of accredited capacity. I'm going to come back to those ELCCs in 2 slides' time when I talk about the kind of the key takeaways. So now if we look at the RPS compliance position under the least cost plus REA. So earlier when I mentioned when we run the least cost plus REA, we say that the New Mexico portion of the load has to meet New Mexico state requirements, so it has to meet the RPS requirement. That is a minimum requirement. It is not a maximum requirement. So we say, hey, you have to meet this need, but you can exceed it. And what we see in the base case modeling result is the amount of solar being added to the system far exceeds what's needed to meet the RPS requirement. So what that tells us is the solar generation is being added to meet the planning reserve margin requirement. So in order to meet the capacity need, it has to add a whole bunch of solar and storage. And in turn, it's adding so much solar and storage, it's actually exceeding the RPS requirement. And if I go to the key takeaways, we've kind of seen that before. We've seen that with SPS's IRP, we saw it with PNMs, and we saw it really across the nation. So what essentially we're saying is in order to meet the RPS with only existing kind of commercially mature technologies, wind, solar, 4-hour and lithium-ion storage, you need to have a substantial overbuild of solar in batteries, right? And this tends to be cost prohibitive. Just completely overbuilding the system becomes extremely expensive. It also becomes more challenging for EP because EP do not have access to high quality wind like PNM and SPS does. So this means instead of being able to bring great wind onto the system, they just continue to overbuild with solar and overbuild with storage. The other issue for EP, and this is not necessarily unique to EP, but at the moment they're a relatively isolated system. SPS, for example, in New Mexico has access to the Southwest Power Pool. They have much more market interaction capability. EP is more isolated. It has less ability to import energy from the market. So what we see when we look at these least cost scenarios is essentially you need alternative solutions. Now, those alternative solutions could be on the supply side. So for example, on a supply side, you could look at long duration storage. So as you start looking at multi-day, 100-hour, for example, energy storage, that's going to get a much higher ELCC value. It's going to have a greater reliability contribution because it can discharge for a longer period of time. So that could offset some of the need to greatly overbuild on short duration storage. Also on the emerging technologies, as I mentioned earlier, you could look at building gas that essentially is carbon free, whether that's carbon capture, whether that's hydrogen fired. Those scenarios, as I said, we have not run yet. We will be running them and presenting them in the 7th meeting, so the next meeting. In addition, you could also look at demand side solutions. So under demand side solutions, you have demand response, you have DERs, for example, you have time of use rates. We have looked at those scenarios as part of the stakeholder requests, and we will be presenting those scenarios in the next 15 minutes or so. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, with the EP not having great connectivity right now to other markets, you could also look at transmission solutions, right? So can EP reduce its resource needs by having greater access to markets elsewhere? And we've done a scenario that we'll be presenting today on greater interconnectivity to the Southwest Power Pool. So all of these scenarios have the potential to bring down that overbuild of solar in short duration storage and potentially reduce costs. Now, full disclosure, we kind of knew this going into the IRP, right? If you've done this long enough, you kind of see the same problems. So as we designed the scenarios and sensitivities, they were all designed around solving these problems. So the results that we've seen today, this overbuild of solar and storage, was pretty expected. We have the scenarios to look at these things like emerging technologies, demand side solutions, and then transmission capabilities. So I'm about to go into the sensitivity results and stakeholder requests. Margie, just pausing real quickly. One, can you still hear me? Are you still awake? And then is there any questions?
Yes to all those questions. So we have a few questions. Ben, I think we'll begin with Anastasia. Please go ahead, Anastasia, with your question.
Am I here?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I'm wondering, and you had it on the screen about transmission alternatives or additional transmission access. Isn't that sort of inevitable, or isn't that part of the decision to join Markets Plus? And if so, how is that affecting the modeling of wind power? Because that's where the wind is, let's face it, right?
Yeah. So can I, Anastasia, do you mind if I just maybe put a pin in that question? I have a whole section on the transmission study, and I think I'm going to answer that question. And if I don't answer the next section, I certainly will circle back to that question.
Sure. I just appreciate, knowing how the modeling to date, the modeling that you're going to show next time actually takes that into account. If at
Okay,
all.
perfect. I will make sure to address that question in the next section.
Thank you.
Great. And Glenn, I think Glenn has a question. Please go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, I think this is related to your process for allocating resources between the two jurisdictions. And I'm looking at, I guess what we saw was your baseline scenario
that added only renewables and storage that was no longer than 4 hours. You talked about it being cost prohibitive, but I'm also concerned about resource adequacy, specifically what happens when there are renewable droughts. So because you're simulating both jurisdictions simultaneously and then sort of carving out New Mexico afterward, could it be the case that the gas plants in Texas are actually supporting resource adequacy in New Mexico?
So they are not supporting resource adequacy from a planning perspective. So if you look at the New Mexico system has its own accredited capacity needs, so the 226 megawatts. So it needs to meet this resource adequacy need. And then to meet the resource adequacy need, we then use ELCC studies to make sure you have enough solar and storage to meet this capacity need under normal planning kind of conditions, right? So under 10 years or 40 years worth of historical weather data. So from a purely resource planning, resource adequacy need, there's enough resources being allocated to New Mexico to meet New Mexico's resource need. Now, from an actual operational perspective, this is a contiguous system, so there's no real way of controlling electron flow.
Yeah.
So it's not like these two are isolated.
But the allocated model is as if the transmission connections didn't cross state lines. Is that fair to say?
Can I get you to say that one more time?
You're allocating so that you have resource adequacy as if there were no power lines crossing the state lines.
No, we are not doing sorry, it's kind of a nuanced question, so let me make sure I get this right. From the perspective of system operations, system reliability, we continue to model the EP system as one, where there are transmission lines that cross state lines. From a resource adequacy planning perspective, in other words, how much does each state need capacity-wise, and then what resources could meet it on an ELCC-wide, then we are isolating the two systems as they were islanded.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Glenn, for the question. Steve Fishman, please go ahead.
Yeah, in looking, you're talking about relying on the renewable resources, existing technologies would be cost prohibitive. And I'm wondering, I'd made a request about doing a cost of carbon modeling. And, I know EPE has suggested using cost of carbon in evaluating the cost effectiveness of energy efficiency. And if you're going to do it there, my question would be, why wouldn't you be using that everywhere? And I think it would be useful to get that cost of carbon scenario out front for people to think about. What are your thoughts on that?
So Steve, you're unfortunately 1 meeting ahead of me. Our plan today, and I'm already skipping slides, but our plan today was to present these 4 modeling scenarios. You can see we're ready to present 3. Yep. Unfortunately, the carbon cost one we thought was done, but what we didn't have was a social cost of carbon associated with market imports and exports. So if you import energy from the market, you can't just assume it's carbon free, right? So we had to kind of go back and reevaluate this one. So unfortunately, this scenario was not done and ready to present for today, but it will be done and ready to present for next meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Margie, any other questions?
I don't see any. Kathy, do you see any?
I don't, but I wonder if I might ask one in anticipation of something that may come up. Ben, on slide 21, the ELCC values, I noticed battery, that ELCC, the accreditation there seems kind of low. Can you address why?
Mainly because of penetration levels. So I also want to clarify, actually, Kathy, that this is 4-hour batteries, right? I cannot kind of be any clearer there. So what we're looking at now is we're starting to see declining or diminishing value of having limited duration battery energy storage. So as you continue to add 4 and 4-hour batteries to the system, they have less value, right? So if you imagine, I'm kind of doing some hand signals here, but if you imagine like a load profile, like a load curve, if you have a 4-hour battery, you can take off a piece of that load at the top, right? And then as you go down through the curve, the duration of the battery needs to become longer to provide additional resource adequacy value. So what we're seeing here right now is this relatively low value for 4-hour batteries, just for the simple reason of EP already has batteries on the system. In 2030, they're going to be adding another 700 megawatts plus what's already in their plans. So they'll be up to, I don't know if I've got it to hand, but over 1,000 megawatts of battery, 4-hour batteries on a system that's 3,000 megawatt peaking system, right? So they're already reaching that saturation point for 4-hour storage. Now, this doesn't mean that batteries do not have value for EP. What it means is you've got to start looking at longer duration storage in order to get these ELCC values up higher. So my thoughts going forward is you're going to start seeing 8-hour batteries, for example, start to creep into these resource plans. And then what's going to be really interesting is when we start looking at these scenarios and sensitivities, and we look at that 100-hour battery. That 100-hour battery is going to have an ELCC value essentially equivalent to gas, right? It's going to be in the 90% range. And then you would start seeing less of a need to overbuild short duration batteries.
Thank you.
Hey, Ben, I think you can proceed. I just want to place a thought as you go through this, as you can help stakeholders understand the numbers that are important for comparing results from different scenarios. I'm sure you're going to talk about that throughout. That's one of the things that we hope to enable stakeholders to be able to compare results across scenarios. So please keep that in mind as we go forward.
I really appreciate you teeing me up, Margie, because I've got about 50 slides ordering that. Okay, so now as we start getting into the sensitivity results, let's start with some disclaimers just real quickly. So first and foremost, these modeling results, when I say are hot off the press, we were updating this presentation up to about half an hour before this meeting started. So just first of all, kudos to the EP modeling team. They have been working around the clock to get these modeling results done. Unfortunately, what that does mean for me is sometimes I haven't had quite enough time to digest them going into this meeting. So just bear with me as we go through these modeling results and just know they are subject to change. And then also, very importantly here, as we start looking at the cost deltas between the least cost scenario case versus one of these scenarios, just know that all of the measures we have not included costs for. So in other words, when we look at rebuilding the Eddy County HVDC tie, we have the benefits associated with rebuilding the tie. We do not have the capital costs to do that construction work. Similarly, when we look at the demand response scenarios, we have the benefits of implementing demand response. We do not have the cost of implementing that program. So we are not showing system savings today. We are showing system benefits. Okay, and then kind of looking again at these 6 stakeholder requests. Today, we will be presenting 3 of the 4 of these initial ones. So we will be looking at the enhanced transmission capability between EPE and the SPP. We will be looking at the C&I demand response program, and then also the residential demand side management, which includes both time of use rates, demand response, behind the meter solar, and storage. Unfortunately, as I just mentioned, the hope was to do all 4 of these scenarios today, and we did have a slight snag with the carbon cost integration scenario. So We will be presenting that at the next meeting. In addition to these kind of 4 scenarios, we also committed to doing some kind of post-analyses work. I think there was a question, and I may be wrong, but I think it was from Mr. Kurtz, to look at kind of how transmission expansion could change resource portfolios. And then also a request from Mr. Simpson, if I'm not mistaken, to look at flexible load for large customers. Both of these would be kind of post-analyses. Once we've done all of the modeling, we'll take a more detailed, more granular look at the modeling results. My expectation is that will probably be in a coffee hours type arrangement. And then as we go into the modeling results, as Margie kind of just alluded to, we're going to try and show some key comparisons under a number of different metrics. So first and foremost, we're going to look at how the resource, or the scenario and sensitivity, excuse me, changes the resource addition. So we'll be comparing the scenario against the least cost plus REA case, and we'll be looking to see how it changes resource additions both on a nameplate and an accredited capacity basis. We'll also be looking to see how it changes the generation mix. So if you do DERs, how does that change EP's annual generation mix? And then finally, we'll be looking at the change in system costs. As I just kind of alluded to, it's kind of quantifying the benefits and not necessarily cost savings. And then finally, just because of the time we have during these meetings, we're going to keep this relatively high level for these stakeholder meetings. And then if, you know, stakeholders have a desire to really get into the modeling weeds and kind of look into more detail, absolutely happy to host an office hours here, and we can really get into some of the more specific modeling results.
So Ben, let me interrupt before you go forward, because I think we have plenty of time. You're doing quite well. I want to see if there are questions about this metrics for comparing results, because this is really going to be essential to today and the next workshop. So could we just see if there are any questions about this? Because there's a lot of information here. I want people to understand how you're proposing to do this comparison. So Ben, anything you wanted to add while we look for hands up on this particular slide?
No, but what I may do, Margie, is once I've got through this next section, I'll give examples, of course, for each of these. I'll make sure to kind of pause and just see if there's anything missing or needs further explanation.
Perfect. That sounds that sounds great. Yeah, Kathy, go ahead with your question on this.
Sure, Ben, I guess I'm going to do the anticipatory questions for you today, but I know this group, we talk quite a bit about greenhouse gas emissions. And is there not a place for comparing emissions in the metrics?
Yes, so in the metrics we're presenting today, no, we just didn't get around to producing emissions chart. We do, of course, have the generation mix, which essentially says we have the data to produce the emissions chart, so we can either supplement during the next meeting, Kathy, or we can take a deeper dive in the office hours. Happy to do either way.
And then I'm wondering, how does no new gas factor into that? Is there a metric to be compared on emissions?
There is definitely a metric to be compared, because keep in mind, most of these scenarios that we're looking at, in fact, all 3 of the scenarios that we're looking at today, are not New Mexico specific. And it's a real good point, Kathy, right? So when we look at these scenarios and we look at greater interconnectivity, for example, to the SPP, well, if EPE were to do that, that would be a system decision, right? You can't just interconnect the New Mexico portion of the system to the SPP. So when we look at all 3 of these scenarios, we actually do them at the first phase in the modeling. So we actually implement the measure on the phase 1 least cost analysis for all 3 of these. So these decisions will actually impact the portfolio of resources being selected in Texas, and it will also impact the system-wide dispatch of the portfolio. So in turn, it can either increase or decrease gas generation and carbon emissions.
Thank you. And I see a hand up, Steve. You want to go ahead?
Yeah.
Wait, Emmanuel, I think has something to add first.
Sorry.
Hey, I'm sorry, really quickly, I've noticed Cynthia's come off mute a couple times. I think she had a question. So after Steve, I think Cynthia.
Okay, so I had the same question as Kathy, but comparing the use of water resources.
When you say water resources, Steve, just to confirm, you're not talking hydro, you're talking things like inlet cooling for gas generation?
Yeah.
We do not have that as a modeling input or modeling output. So we couldn't present that from a modeling perspective. If we want to go through and just kind of make some assumptions that if you build, I don't know, new gas generation for Texas, would it have any inlet cooling requirements? It's going to be really, really marginal and probably specific more to Texas and New Mexico, but we can certainly look at how we could do that.
Yeah, how it impacts use of water, particularly potable water, I think is useful information for all of us to have.
Okay, I think that's going to be extremely marginal, if at all, in New Mexico, but let me speak to the EP experts on that and we can kind of address that in the next meeting.
And that's good information if that's the result as well. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Steve. Cynthia, did you have a question about comparing modeling results?
I do. On cost of carbon, I think the way at least some of us were thinking about it is that it's not a one-off sensitivity, but actually the cost of carbon is a variable that's included as a cost across all the analysis. And so if you don't have that that variable done yet, completed yet, then how should we interpret the results that you're getting ready to present?
So can you explain that, please, Cynthia, when you say across all of the analyses? How would you want that implemented?
So there's benefits of DERs across, and you have several scenarios here that you're looking at, and you're looking at the benefits, right?
Correct.
So avoidance of the cost of carbon is a benefit.
Okay, sorry, Cynthia, I'm maybe just a little more specific here. So there's two ways of doing this from a modeling approach, right? You can either assign a social cost of carbon or a carbon tax on the capacity expansion component. So what resources should be built from the model and does it impact the social cost of carbon? That would be somewhat irrelevant for New Mexico because you do not have any new carbon resources coming in these cases, right? So the only potential impact would be, should New Mexico build more renewable resources than needed in order to drive down the dispatch of carbon emitting resources? So it doesn't impact new resource build. All it would impact is the dispatch of existing resources. Is that what you're asking for?
I guess that's in part what I'm asking for. I'm just thinking, I know on the with the New Mexico energy efficiency filing, you include a social cost of carbon, or EP does, in the evaluation of efficiency benefits. And it would see, and that's also within the context of not building any gas in New Mexico. So it would seem that you would carry that variable analysis over to all your DER analysis.
Well, so in that particular example, when you start looking at energy efficiency, what you're looking at doing is avoiding generation, right? So you're avoiding generation from the existing fleet. And in turn, by avoiding generation, you're reducing emissions and you assign a value to that stream. What we're looking at here, though, is specifically new build. So none of this new build has any carbon emissions associated with it. So That's where I'm struggling a little bit. So what you're essentially doing is saying, okay, for the purposes of capacity expansion and not production cost, that we need to build additional resources above everything that we're presenting today to drive down the dispatch of your existing thermal fleet. And keep in mind, you're already overbuilding to meet the RPS. So happy to look into that for additional scenarios other than the one we're looking at.
I'm not asking for that. I'm not asking for you to overbuild renewables to offset generation that's largely depreciated on the system.
Okay, I don't. So in that case, I don't know if that's not the goal. Then all you're doing is adding cost to the portfolio by the cost, the social cost of carbon, because the renewables already must run.
This is Nancy, and I think where some of these I think where some of these questions came from. There was a question about adding a emissions benefit to demand side resources, and you know what EP has done in its most recent energy efficiency load management filing under the efficient use of energy act is added a emissions benefit to the utility cost test. So when we were calculating the utility cost test, we added a avoided emissions benefit on the into that calculation. The commission rejected that proposal that we made. I know CCA's just filed a motion for a hearing on that issue, but you know, it's a big deal just in terms of coming forward. I don't know that we've really talked about that and how it translates into some of the capacity expansion modeling. I think that's where that question originated from.
I have a take on this question. So if you look at you're considering natural gas generation, let's say, if you were to look at an element that's added to that generator or a more efficient model of a generator, then there could be some additional benefits that would be quantified in that case, right? Or if you're looking at a nuclear generator, there could be some benefits added to that that would help the cost effectiveness of those so non-renewable generation, you know, could potentially have a benefit as well. But you're saying that all the generation here being considered is renewable?
For the New Mexico piece, that's
For New
correct,
Mexico.
George.
For New Mexico. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that case, I mean, one other element is you know, are there solar technologies where there's a claim, you know, let's say, you know, thin film, you know, has less carbon embedded in it versus crystalline technology or something like that. So I don't know if you're getting, you know, that fine in the analysis, or let's say you're looking at lithium iron phosphate batteries versus some other battery chemistry. Is there a difference in the carbon there just due to manufacturing or weight or transportation? But you know, it could be a very small number, right? I'm not sure, but even in renewable generation, there's some embedded carbon cost. The other thing would be like, are you using locally sourced modules, or are you transporting modules from across the other side of the world, right? And there's some transportation carbon elements there. But that's the only way I can think of, you know, that where maybe it's applicable in this case, but it could be a very small number compared to looking at two different types of generation.
So Ben, I'm
I
going to
appreciate that, but can we let me just back up and try and simplify this and suggest that I think what Steve and some of others are interested in is that if you're applying a social cost of carbon to energy efficiency, do it also to this DER modeling and just go with that.
Okay, sorry, Sophia, I swear I'm not trying to be confrontational here, but just to confirm, are you talking about doing it on all scenarios or just the DER scenario?
The DER scenarios that we're
Okay.
modeling DER, and include a social cost of carbon. And this gets to this matter that hopefully we'll be talking about, that there will be time to talk about today, which is that value added stream that Chris Hickman has been working with EP and E3 on. And this is one of the value addeds that we see of DERs, is the ability to avoid, displace that social cost of carbon.
So Cynthia, the reason I asked that question is because that then becomes essentially a modeling output. Is essentially you're not using that social cost to influence the dispatch of the model. You're simply looking at what comes out of the model, and then you're assigning an imputed value to carbon savings. So that's why I kind of was, asking those deeper questions to understand how we do it.
Okay, so as a imputed value, yeah, I'd like to think about that on the output and see if that has the same value added benefit as including that as part of a value added.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Go ahead, Ben, let's continue with your presentation then.
Okay. So in this case, we're going to look at the greater market enhancement or market capability to the SPP. And just a reminder, kind of as we look at this scenario with the 30,000-foot view here, essentially what we're looking at doing is the Southwest Power Pool is represented by this bubble up here to the top right. And we have a 200 megawatt bidirectional pipe that flows into EP's northeast zone. Right now, this HVDC tie here, kind of represented by this dot, is actually in service. It's operational. It is somewhat unreliable and requires significant investment. So the assumption in the base case, so in the least cost plus REA case, is unless this investment occurs by 2030, essentially this tie, this market capability has gone away. And then in the change case, so in this scenario, we assume there's investment made into the tie, it's essentially rebuilt, and you have, once again, the 200 megawatt capability in import and export. So kind of just going to the more detailed modeling assumptions here. As I just mentioned, assuming the Eddy HVDC tie gets rebuilt in 2030, gives you 200 megawatts of import-export capability, either to or from the SPP. We have a market price forecast where essentially there is a strip, an hourly price forecast for the SPP. And if at any hour during the year, the market is lower cost than the marginal production cost from EPE's unit, it will buy, EPE's model will buy from the market instead of, say, ramping up a gas generator. And then if there's moments in time when the market price is higher, then EP may run additional units to then sell into the market, right? So that's kind of how these kind of Southwest Power Pool operates, how other power pools, RTOs operate. Now to, I think, Anastasia's question earlier, how do we kind of think about wind? Well, what we do with the Southwest Power Pool particularly is we do not have the entire SPP being modeled within EP's Plexus model. So we don't have every single generator within the SPP. So we can't say for sure, oh, by the way, this electron's coming from this wind farm or this solar farm or this gas plant. Instead, what we have is a market profile. And that market profile was created doing a full regional dispatch of the SPP. So E3, one of the services we offer, is we essentially model the entire Southwest Power Pool footprint and all of the other RTOs in the country. And we essentially say, okay, during these given hours, these are the units that will be dispatching. And this would be the marginal unit, the LMP from the SPP. So Directly, we are not modeling additional wind, solar, gas, whatever may be coming from the SPP. Indirectly, we are through the market price forecast. And then finally, we took a relatively conservative assumption that the eddy tie would provide 70 megawatts of firm capacity. So we would have 70 megawatts of accredited capacity coming across the tie. Now that is based on just kind of historical reliance that EPE has had on eddy. So historically, they have assumed that during times of critical need, critical periods, they'll be able to import 70 megawatts of energy during those periods. There is a potential for this number to be higher if EPE were to sign bilateral agreements with other parties on the other side of the tie. So on the other side of eddy, you have SPS, for example. If EPE entered into a contract with SPS to buy firm capacity, you have the potential to have more firm capacity available coming over this tie. So first of all, let's look what happens to the resources when you have this assumption for new transmission capability. So I'm just going to level set everyone because we have this very similar graph for almost every slide here. So what we see is the change between the least cost and REA case and the change case in this example, the market enhancement case. So what this is saying is in 2030, if you have that tie line in place, the model is going to build more solar generation, more wind generation, and it's going to build less gas generation and less battery energy storage, 4-hour lithium-ion batteries, right? And you can look at that across the entire planning horizon, 2030, when we first have these measures come in place, through to the end of the 20-year planning horizon. And you could see that essentially the model brings on wind generation earlier. So in 2031, for EPE, not the SPP, for EPE specifically, the model selects more wind generation. Overall, though, over the whole 15 years that we see here, the wind generation actually evens out. It actually builds almost identical amount of wind generation. So having greater market interaction doesn't build more wind, it simply accelerates the build of wind. When we look at solar, it actually builds more solar generation. Not a huge amount, but it actually does end up building more solar generation. What it actually does, though, what the specific really kind of deliverable here is it builds less CTs and less storage over the planning horizon. So that kind of makes sense, right? If you turn around and you say to the model, hey, you have 200 megawatts of energy, 70 megawatts of capacity, that's always available to buy from, then it kind of intrinsically makes sense that you need less dispatchable resources. You need less gas generation, less storage, because at those times when the peaking units would be running, you can go out and you can buy from the market. You can go out and you can buy wind generation at 2 o'clock in the morning when the SPP has an oversupply, as opposed to having to turn on the CT. Here we just see that same information, just presented slightly differently. So again, I'm going to just take some time to level set everyone with the charts here. On the left-hand side, we see the resource build system-wide without eddy being built. And then we see the resource build on a nameplate basis with eddy being rebuilt. And what you see, as I just described, is up here is the least cost plus REA case, so kind of the base case. And then down here is with the rebuild case, the HVDC tie case. You can see the quantities of megawatts of resources changing. And down here, you see the difference on a cumulative basis. So as I mentioned earlier, a little bit more wind ahead of time, less gas generation across the board, so just build less gas, a little more solar resources, and less batteries. We can then see this kind of on a New Mexico basis. It's essentially the same solution. It's just obviously just prorated to be kind of just reflective of wind, solar, and storage that's been assigned to New Mexico. So again, similar sort of stories, wind stays the same. Actually building just ever so slightly less solar being assigned to New Mexico here, overall 27 megawatts less. Building less batteries, and then obviously you're getting some capacity of that kind of 200 megawatts nameplate coming across the tie. So now let's look at it on an accredited capacity perspective. So all of these slides were nameplate. Now we're looking at accredited. So how much capacity, what's the ELCC value coming across this tie? So we assume the ELCC value was 70 megawatts. And what you'll see here is this pinky color line shows the 70 megawatts capacity value that the tie is providing. And then you'll see there's some kind of noise changes just as the resource portfolio changes in addition to the 70 megawatts. And then critically, what you see is less gas generation providing accredited capacity across the system. Obviously, it's for Texas, the gas component, but this is saying you need less gas on the least cost case. And then you could also see a slight reduction in solar and storage. Just want to quickly maybe just pause and just highlight just a slight nuance in these charts. As I mentioned, we were doing this right up to the beginning of this meeting. When we look at nameplate, we do break out solar and storage separately, so you can see them as separate values on the charts. Unfortunately, the way we model solar and storage within Plexos is a combined service ELCC. So they have a direct correlation and relationship where the value of ELCC value of solar and storage are dependent upon each other. So we model them as a single one. So you see in some of these charts, they're actually combined, and that's why you see them red here. So this is again just looking at the ELCC value, just on a slightly different presentation format. And you'll see that it provides the same amount of ELCC value system-wide in both the with and the without case. So in other words, if you add 70 megawatts of accredited capacity to the tie, it reduces the accredited capacity need from dispatchable resources by exactly the same amount in the early years, 2030, 25, and has a slight difference, minor modeling noise in the out years. We see it again here on the New Mexico specific piece. So of the 70 megawatts of accredited capacity, New Mexico would get approximately 20% of that, being 20% of the system. So we get 13, 14 megawatts, and it avoids 13, 14 megawatts of accredited capacity of solar and storage being built. Now keep in mind, because of the low ELCC values of solar on the EP system, this actually represents a decent amount of nameplate capacity that's been avoided. And now, kind of as we look at what happens to the energy now, so we've talked about capacity, what happens on an energy perspective? So again, we're looking here at the eddy tie analysis, comparing it to the least cost plus REA case. And what you're seeing is a lot more solar generation. Now, keep in mind, you're building slightly more solar, so it makes sense that you have more solar generation. You see significantly less gas generation in most years, and that is because, again, you're building less gas generation. And then you see kind of this initial tranche of wind. Now, just recall that's basically because you're accelerating the wind build. So overall, over the 15 years, the wind generation stays about constant. You just see more wind generation up front. So if we look at kind of like the key takeaways from this slide, you're seeing increased annual renewable generation, particularly from solar resources. You're seeing a decrease from natural gas-fired resources. You're also seeing greater connectivity to the wind-rich SPP. I think there's like 30 gigawatts of wind within the SPP. So that's not reflected here, right? When you're buying from the market, essentially there's a higher chance that you're buying kind of a cleaner mix of SPP energy just because it has this wind component in the non-peak hours. And then overall, if you look at greater market interactions and you look at why utilities join power pools, why they join RTOs, essentially you're increasing the diversity, the resiliency and the economic opportunities of your generation fleet. So diversity meaning you have another resource outside of local solar, for example. And I think it was Glenn earlier, I may be wrong, but Glenn had kind of raised a concern about solar droughts or renewable droughts. If you have greater connectivity to a third-party market, you have more geographical diversity, you have less exposure to those kind of events. Let's kind of repeat it again with resiliency. And then economic opportunities provides more of an opportunity for arbitrage when you're looking at batteries. So if you have access to a bigger market, you have the option to charge batteries when energy prices are lower coming from the market. And then you have the opportunity to discharge batteries when prices are higher, again, looking across EP into the SPP fleet. So now if we look at costs, because this is, I think, where people are going to get interested. So first of all, just reminding everyone, this does not include the cost to rebuild the tie. So this is just essentially looking at the benefits without looking at the cost to construct. These cost savings, or cost benefits, I should say, are based on the 70 megawatts of accredited capacity. And essentially, it saves pretty much $50 million on a nominal basis every single year of the modeling period. So you see here, there's some additional solar costs. That's because you're building more solar, right? You're saving on gas costs. You're building less gas. You're running your gas less. You're saving on battery costs. You're building less batteries. And then you have some savings here associated with the energy market. So arbitrage opportunities of buying low, selling high. Over the 15 years, $50 million, give or take, you have benefits of $824 million on a nominal basis. And then if you convert that to a net present value basis, you see 376 megawatts of MVP savings. And again, this is just over a 15-year planning period. Obviously, transmission typically lasts longer than 15 years. You'd expect these cost savings or these cost benefits to continue on. So if we just look real quickly at the key takeaways, and then I promise I'll pause for questions. The eddy tie provides 200 megawatts of bidirectional connectivity to the SPP. We assume 70 megawatts of accredited capacity from the tie. And this offset the equivalent amount of dispatchable accredited capacity. So almost on a one-for-one basis, 70 megawatts offset 70 megawatts of natural gas-fired generation, and to a lesser extent, energy storage. Overall, it increased renewable energy production and decreased reliance on natural gas-fired generation. Economic benefits of $50 million a year, more in the latter years, and likely go beyond the planning period. And as I mentioned, greater market connectivity provides diversity, resiliency, and economic opportunities. So all in all, if we look at this case, it pretty much aligns with not just EP's objectives here, but kind of just utility best practices, utility resource planning of increasing reliability, maintaining affordability, and ever increasingly clean power, right? This one kind of checks the box on all three. So to me, this was a really, really strong kind of scenario sensitivity. Just maybe I'll pause here, see if any of the stakeholders, Margie, have any questions on this analysis.
Great, thanks, Ben. I think because we've been going for a bit, we're going to take a 10-minute break. We have a couple of questions we will come back to. First question will be to Anastasia, whether her question has been answered, and then we'll go to the others and then move to the demand side resources scenarios. So it's please keep in mind your questions, and we'll come back to this for just a few minutes before we switch topics. It's 2:43. We'll take 10 minutes and come back at 2:53 for your cup of tea, your caffeine, whatever you might need to get a stretch break. We'll see you back in a few minutes. Thank you, Ben.
Hey, Margie, just confirming you can see my screen.
Yep, thanks, Ben. We're back. Thank you. I guess I'm not quite 10 minutes. I'll give it a few seconds. Yeah. This conversation about the Eddy County HV high voltage DC tie, let's go back first to Anastasia's question earlier about Anastasia, maybe you have like to know whether your question was answered or if you have a different one. Let's go first with Anastasia, and then Glenn has his hand up, and a couple others. But let's try to get through these quickly. Go ahead, Anastasia.
Hi. So I'm not sure that my first question has been answered, Ben, about whether you're really modeling specific this thing where you're talking about not being specific about what's coming from the Southwest Power Pool. I guess I'm not clear whether or to what extent you considered bringing in specific renewable PPAs through that I. And then the second question that follows up is did you do that as a sort of a least cost plus REA alternative for New Mexico? And that may come into the cost allocation issue next week, or I think it's next meeting. But it seems like that might be the New Mexico option, if not a perfect option for the whole system. So if you could answer essentially the questions I put up in writing.
Okay, and I cannot see the questions in writing just because I'm sharing my screen.
Here, I'll write them. I'll read them for you, Ben. It says, it seems like adding only renewable, oh, wait, that's the wrong one. How has EP's decision to join the Markets Plus affected?
No. I think I'm down at the well.
Go ahead, Anastasia.
I think that you've answered the first one from 150. I'm talking about the two at the bottom of the chat box, and Ben, I'll read them myself. Ben, my question really had to do more with committed wind resources, i.e. a long-term PPA located in the SPP region. I'm not sure what you were saying addresses that. Would you please explain? And this is the right, I think, slide for that. And then this follow-up question to that was also if EPE can do a least cost plus REA modeling to address New Mexico's REA requirements, why not model the least cost REA with the Eddy County tie as an incremental, the tie itself as an incremental resource for New Mexico at the full 70 megawatts compared to treating it as a system resource with only 13 megawatts of capacity allocated to New Mexico.
Okay, perfect. Understand both the questions.
That's a mouthful, but I know that you know your stuff, so.
Anastasia,
that makes sense.
Before you answer, Anastasia, those did not come across in the chat, so please repost those. We are not seeing them.
Oh, okay. I will try to hit the button there and see whether that helps. Did that happen?
But go ahead, Ben.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
I'll copy and resend them
for
the purposes of the chat, or try.
And I appreciate the follow-up clarification there, because I did not answer that first question. So to your point, right now, we have not assumed any specific resources within the SPP, right? We just modeled the SPP market as it stands today. One of the potential additional benefits to Eddy that we do not currently have is whether at any point between the SPP and the point it connects to the EP system, whether rebuilding this tie or rebuilding the transmission that serves the tie could provide access to lower cost renewable resources. So let me just give you an example there, Anastasia. If rebuilding this transmission line here between the tie and between the Northeast, if that upgrade allowed EP to sign a wind PPA, in that the cost for that wind PPA, was less than we have in the model, that would potentially be an additional benefit. We do not have that in the model right now. Happy to work with the EPE team and see if they feel like doing this transmission upgrade will potentially allow EP to interconnect lower cost renewable resources. So that's an addition we can do. The second question is, why don't we just assign all of this benefit to New Mexico and not assign the benefit to Texas and New Mexico? I will answer that strictly from a modeling perspective, and then I will throw it over to EP and see if they want to add any clarity from kind of a regulatory kind of system perspective. But just purely from a modeling perspective, the eddy tie is an economical solution. In other words, it isn't an incremental cost to do this scenario. It actually saves money. So therefore, the expectation from our modeling approach is anything that reduces overall system cost benefits both Texas and New Mexico, and both ratepayers or customers on either side of the state line should share in those benefits. So that's how we've approached it from a modeling perspective, but I will throw it over maybe to Emmanuel to approach that maybe from
Before Emmanuel answers, may I ask one thing? And that's based then on what you've been saying is that you haven't modeled the actual real world cost of doing that Eddy County tie transmission.
Correct.
Right? So it's
Correct.
not, it's if this assumption that it's an economical resource is based on the idea that it's got to be economical because you're not putting in the costs. Kind of.
I would go just one step further, and I don't want to maybe speculate. I would go through the assumption that it's economical is by looking at the benefits and having a general understanding what I think it would cost. I would put that as a high likelihood, but to your point, Anastasia, certainly not modeled that yet.
Great, thank you. I see we have two other hands up on this scenario, and we have two other scenarios to talk about in the next 45 minutes. So Ben, let me ask your desire, unless Emmanuel wants to comment on this discussion before we move on.
I was just gonna, I guess if we expand the conversation a little bit, Ben, the assumptions used in the model for the eddy tie upgrade, are those the same assumptions we had provided in the past?
They are, with the exception of the cost. There was no cost modeled.
Okay. Yeah, then we can certainly address that afterwards, but yeah, so we can get a more accurate picture. I appreciate the recommendation, Ms. Stevens.
Thank you.
Great. So Chris and Ben, let me see what your thought is about going forward here. I know there's a lot of discussion about the demand side scenarios, and we have two of them. Would you like to take the questions from Glenn and Chris at this point on this scenario, or wait till we get done, and then if we have to set up an office hour to dig in deeper?
I can take the questions, Margie, or both the other scenarios have exactly the same slides, so I can go through them much quicker.
Okay, Glenn, please go ahead.
Sure. So I think you were saying that the power that would come over the tie could either be a bilateral agreement or something purchased in Market Plus. Is that fair?
The energy coming over the line would be just kind of purchased from the market. So you'd buy the energy from the SPP, and then the capacity coming across the line could potentially be a longer term bilateral agreement.
Oh, you'd need the capacity before you could buy the power. You need both.
You could buy the energy just from the market. So you would just buy energy, but in order to count more than the 70 megawatts of accredited capacity, which is just calculated based on historical energy purchases during critical periods, in order to have a firm resource where you could say we're getting 200 megawatts of accredited capacity, the recommendation would be you would have a firm contract in place for kind of guaranteed rights during that period.
Gotcha. Okay. And that would be needed to buy any power from Market Plus. You said you could use the existing low-level accredited capacity, but to expand that, to get any additional power from Market Plus, you'd have to have that contract for the transmission.
And just to be clear, we're modeling energy availability at 200 megawatts at all times. So you could always purchase 200 megawatts of energy at any given time over the tie. We're just literally talking about the firm accredited capacity and what you could assume would be available at any given time. Now, you could make the assumption that there was always 200 megawatts of energy on the other side of the tie, even during critical periods. And using that more aggressive assumption, you would have a 200 megawatt accredited capacity value for the tie. The way we've done it at the moment is kind of make a more conservative assumption that it would be, just less than half of that, 70 megawatts. And that's kind of just a bit of an assumption. I guess what I'm saying there, Glenn, is my recommendation is if you want to get up to assuming that you always have 200 megawatts available, even during peak periods, you really want some sort of contractual arrangement in place to kind of firm up that assumption.
That's the bilateral contract. You wouldn't
Correct. Yes,
be
sir.
buying that from the market.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Yeah. There's a lot of complexity in using that tie. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Chris, go ahead, and then Cynthia's got one clarification she wants on where we're using 4 or 8 hour battery on this scenario. But please, Chris, go ahead first.
So just a comment on the Eddy County tie. It would seem that because again, the opportunity for low cost wind, since there's such a glut of it in SPP, that potentially EPE could utilize some value streams for 4 or 8 hour batteries to be able to absorb that wind in those periods of time it's available and delivering that more effectively into the EPE system on peak as part of that overall analysis. Just a thought.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get at, Chris. Thanks for giving the opportunity to expand here. With this economic opportunities, if you have this huge RTO, to your east, and it has a huge amount of wind in the SPP, theoretically speaking, at times of high wind production in low load, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, locational marginal prices, LMPs, often go extremely low, even negative in the SPP. So theoretically speaking, that's because there's oversupply, under demand. If EP was available, they could import some of that energy in at low cost, charge their energy storage resources, and then when prices are higher or the marginal cost to produce is higher, then they can discharge the battery. So yes, in short, Chris, having access to the market gives you much greater economic arbitrage opportunities.
Yeah, and I just, it seemed when you were going through it, it was talking about the ELCC of batteries driving lower system resources and things like that. And I think in this particular case with Eddy County, it may be more appropriate that EP gets to look at some of the value streams for that arbitrage and being able to move that resource around in time with those storage resources. Just again, thought process about specific to this case and the capabilities that we know exist there.
Yeah, and what we see here on this graph, Chris, just so everyone's aware, is this gray box here, this gray part of the chart. This is those energy market benefits. So this is the net value of selling energy and buying energy, and this is kind of the economic value of joining Eddy or SPP through Eddy.
Great, thank you.
And Ben, just clarification, in this scenario, are you using 4 or 8 hour battery?
So in all scenarios, we gave the model the choice to pick either 4 hour or 8 hour lithium ion. Right now, and I want to say this with a grain of salt, the model is selecting 4 hour batteries. However, my gut feeling, without being able to prove this right now, is we're on a precipice where I feel like when we go out and test the market and you actually see real market pricing, I wouldn't be surprised if we're on that point teetering where 8 hour storage would start being selected by the model. So I think we're really close at the moment. Model selecting 100% 4 hour. I think we're really close to it switching over to 8 hour.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Ben, why don't you continue on? I see another question on a different topic from Don Kurtz. Don, we will either come back to this after at the end or follow up with you on your question about gas resources. So we'll come back to that. Let's continue on the demand side, demand scenarios.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's start with the easier one of the two, and let's start with the C&I demand response. So this is just a straightforward interruptible program. So if we look at the modeling parameters here, we're assuming, again, the base load forecast. So we're looking at kind of just the forecast we've looked at so far. We're assuming 100 megawatts of demand response, interruptible demand response. That essentially means it sheds DR. So it reduces the load by up to 100 megawatts, and it does not push that load into a subsequent or prior hour. So you're literally interrupting load. You can discharge it up to 100% of its nameplate, so it can be discharged up to 100 megawatts. And then we have these restrictions on it where it's 6 hours per call, and that's a maximum time. So you could call it for as little as 1 hour up to 6 hours. You can call it 12 times per season or 48 times per annum. And then its maximum is 1 call per day. So these are kind of the restrictions upon the demand response program. Now, I want to come out here and say these results were a little surprising to me, but I think they do make sense. We will obviously do some more QA/QC. As you look at adding the demand response to the system, what it actually does is reduces the amount of solar and storage resources being added. And it had a relatively marginal impact on the amount of gas resources that were being added. So I think, maybe going into this, there's somewhat of an expectation of, hey, if you have demand response, it decreases your need for dispatchable resources. In this case, we're seeing it reduce the amount of solar and storage being added in the model. So that kind of asks the question, okay, well, why would that be? And if we went back to an earlier slide, and I won't go back there just now, we had the RPS compliance within New Mexico. And I showed that the capacity expansion model was overbuilding resources to then needed to meet the RPS. So essentially was building solar and storage to meet plan and reserve margin requirements. So building solar and storage to provide capacity. As we showed earlier, we're at a point where solar certainly has pretty minimal marginal ELCC value. So what it's actually saying is, if I do not need as much planning reserves, or if I do not need as much accredited capacity because I have lower demand, then what it actually does is it avoids building some of that solar and storage and still is able to meet the RPS. So I think it's a little bit different to maybe what people are expecting. This case doesn't necessarily avoid gas builds. What it does do is it reduces that overbuild that I described earlier of solar and storage resources. So if we look at it here, you'll see on a system-wide basis that essentially it avoids again, level setting. Here is the case without the C&I demand response program. Here is the case with the C&I demand response program, and then here is the delta between the two. Overall, it builds essentially the same amount of wind, builds pretty much the same amount of CTs, only slightly less, and it avoids approximately 100 megawatts, 80, 90 megawatts here of solar and storage on a nameplate basis. When we look at that on a New Mexico basis, here we assigned the DR program 50-50. So we did not assign it based on the load ratio share, kind of like Anastasia's point earlier, we did this 50-50. New Mexico customers get a 50%, Texas customers gets 50%. So you see it's adding this C&I demand response program, 50 megawatts nameplate to New Mexico, and then avoiding all this solar and storage build out. And if we look at this on an accredited capacity basis, these numbers are essentially the same. So once again, we solve exactly on a system-wide basis to the plan and reserve margin requirement. So whatever we reduce on an accredited capacity basis for demand response, we save that exact same amount of accredited capacity from wind, solar storage, and then marginally gas units. Now, I will say, just for our initial modeling pass, we modeled this scenario with a 35% ELCC. So under the parameters that I described earlier, got 35% DR. If we were to look at this again with longer duration, more options for cores, you can see an increase to the ELCC. And what that would do is almost certainly increase the amount of solar and storage that is avoided in this scenario. So if you went up to, say, 50 megawatts ELCC value, it would avoid 50 megawatts of accredited wind, solar storage, and expectedly only a small amount of gas. Again, just look here, just real quickly. This is looking at on a system accredited capacity perspective. So once again, you can see we're building the same amount of accredited capacity with the with and the without cases. All you're doing is sacrificing some solar and storage for additional demand response. See the same here on New Mexico. And I'm intentionally going through these a little bit quicker because of the same charts I showed earlier. And now this is what is surprising. So if we look at the energy impact of having additional demand response, what we actually see is the impact of the demand response program from an energy perspective is marginal, right? You can call up to 100 megawatts up to 6 hours a time, 48 times a year. It doesn't really avoid much energy. But what it does do is it changes the resources that are built. So if you're building less solar resources and you're building less wind resources because you no longer need them for capacity, then you have less solar resources dispatching. So you actually have less solar generation in every single year that we look at this model. Now, if you take away solar generation and you don't build any additional resources, it can only dispatch thermal generation or storage. So you actually see in this demand response scenario, more gas generation, more discharge from batteries coming out. So essentially what you're doing is you're increasing the capacity factor of your existing resources because you're building less resources to meet your plan and reserve margin requirement. So these results at first we paused on them, we took another look at them, and they fundamentally kind of do make sense, and we obviously QA/QC these in a little more detail. If we look now on customer savings, so the customer savings of this 100 megawatt demand response program under the parameters that we looked up, including 35 megawatts of accredited capacity, provided around $15 to $20 million of nominal benefits on an annual basis. So you can see here customer savings on this black line, or I keep saying savings, and please excuse me, it should be benefits. Benefits here on this black line. And where are those benefits coming from? They're largely coming from the fact that you have less solar, less batteries on the system, so you're saving the cost of those resources. And then you're actually seeing occasionally some more gas generation. This is extremely marginal, right? This axis is $5 million on hundreds of $1 million of operating costs. So marginally, these are about the same. So kind of key takeaways here as we look at the C&I demand response program. Incremental C&I demand response offsets the need for new supply side resources to meet the plan and reserve margin requirement. That is as expected. The resources that it avoids, though, is actually solar and storage. And again, kind of counterintuitive at first, but kind of makes sense when you consider that EPE would be overbuilding the system to meet its plan and reserve margin requirements far in excess of the renewable portfolio standards. And then when you have fewer solar resources coming online, you need to back that generation up. So all of those kind of the missing megawatts that are no longer being created by the solar generation, you essentially backfill that in with your existing dispatchable resources, gas and energy storage. And then again, just kind of a caveat, we modeled it with a certain sense of parameters. If you were to change those parameters, you could increase its ELCC and by increasing its ELCC, would essentially likely have a linear impact. And as again, if you have 35 megawatts at the moment, if you went to 50 megawatts, you would likely just avoid 50 megawatts of accredited solar and storage. And then just recapping the benefits of the program, kind of range between $15 and $20 million on a nominal basis per year. Margie, would you like me to keep going, or would you like me to pause for questions on this one?
So I'm wondering if Don Kurtz's question from earlier would be appropriate to take at this point. Let me, Don, I don't know if you're still here. Don was, it's related, it's not direct, but it has to do with this interaction and the use of these gas resources in protect this case. Don was asking that if existing renewable resources are already treated by EP as must run, that's great. Solar resources don't have to be curtailed and no fuels being burned. He's concerned that existing gas turbines are being used for off-system sales, which I don't think is supportive of the intent of the Energy Transition Act. Don, can you just explain what you mean by off-system sales, and perhaps this is a place to address this?
Yeah, well, occasionally we've talked to El Paso Electric. It was presented as an achievement that at certain times they were getting gas at a really low price, and so they could save customers a little money back on their bill by selling that electricity to other systems. And that never really seemed like what the franchise was for, to be a gas burning utility selling somewhere else. And so it's always stuck in my mind. And since for whatever reason, it seemed like a question I have about that.
So Margie, maybe to break that initial question that you read down into two pieces. First, just to clarify on the concept of must run in non-curtailments. So there's different types of curtailments, right? There's economic curtailments, and then there's kind of more system curtailments. So when we model renewable resources, we model renewable resources as must run, which means that essentially they are must take units, must take generation in the resource stack. So those resources are selected first. But what that doesn't mean is there's no curtailments. Because if you overbuild solar generation above demand, then any solar generation that cannot either be sold into a market or used to charge a battery could still be curtailed. And there are some more detailed nuances when you start looking at transmission constraints. You can have solar curtailments. It's marginal. I don't think we see any curtailments really in the model, but I just didn't want people to confuse must run saying there are no curtailments. Those aren't quite synonymous. But more to Don's question, again, I will approach this from a pure modeling perspective, and then I will hand it over to EPE if they have kind of more some system kind of context or EP context. Don, I understand the concern. I would respond like this, though. If EPE is selling gas generation as a marginal off-sale system or system sale to a kind of another RTO, it means the cost of that generation is lower marginal cost than the purchaser's own marginal cost would be. So in other words, if EP is selling gas generation at a certain price point, it means it's lower than the buyer's marginal price point. So what that also usually means is more efficient generation is actually offsetting less efficient generation from the buyer's perspective. So if you looked at this not just from an EP's perspective, but you looked at it from a national kind of model where you assumed all of the RTOs, that gas generation that EP is selling to whoever it is, APS, let's pick on them, is likely offsetting a less efficient gas generator from APS, and actually you see carbon emissions nationally decreasing. But that's a modeling geek question. I'll pass it over to EP if they want to provide some more context from their system.
Sure. Don, I think I understand your question, and I'm going to guess you're on the side of it's lower carbon emissions is the intent of the Energy Transition Act. I know historically, you know, as we go in for fuel reconciliations, we talk a great deal about off-system sales margins, which come from natural gas generation. And I think those have been reconciled since the Energy Transition Act. If I recall, the latest fuel reconciliation, I think was in 2022, maybe, which I believe was after the Energy Transition Act. So I think, I'm just going off of, I'm not a regulatory attorney, but I think those are allowed, or at least it didn't come up that they weren't allowed in our fuel reconciliations. I don't think you're talking about just off-system sales in general, right? I mean, if we have excess, if we're at must run and we have excess anything and we need to balance the system, we should be making off-system sales to balance the system. I just want to set the parameters maybe by which you're asking your question.
Yeah, right. And I do agree with that, Dave, that, you know, there's things you have to do just because that particular resource has to run. Okay, we'll sell it off. So yeah, that's good. I think I was told before when I raised one of these questions is that, and in fact, if you have excess renewable, you're going to be selling that first anyway. I don't know if that's true or not, but that was mentioned to me by somebody I talked to at El Paso Electric. So yeah, I don't really know, but you're right on that assumption that I don't worry about the balancing so much as just, hey, we got a chance to sell some gas here. Let's do it.
Yeah, and I think if an opportunity to sell, so let me go to your first part. If there is excess generation, we do view the minimum run fossil fuel generation as must run, that if we can't take it offline, it is must run. That could contribute to off-system sales. Similarly, we look at renewable energy. It is producing. We don't necessarily control the spigot unless there is a reliability issue. That reliability issue would come if we can't find a place to put that energy on someone else's system. So I think that is a true statement that we will run renewables and must run generation at its minimum levels to the extent that we can't find a home on someone else's system for it. At that point, if we can't, I think renewables become the next option before that must run generation that we can't cycle off. I think that's maybe, just want to get clarification on the first part of what you're saying. The second part, yes, we make off-system sales from these gas generating units. I hope I'm not going too far to say to no financial benefit of EPE. All those off-system sales margins, all those revenues from those fossil fuel generators flow back as a fuel credit directly to customers 100%.
Yeah, I do understand that, and I think El Paso Electric's trying to help consumers in that way. But personally, I mean, I'm not interested in being part of a gas sales company, and so the fact that it's being sold, we're burning fossil fuels in the state of New Mexico for reasons that aren't necessary. And really, I haven't noticed that much difference on my bill. I mean, it's even if it were, I just don't think that's what the franchise entails, is having a company that's selling a significant amount of gas, burning a significant amount of gas to sell to customers elsewhere.
So, Don, I hear your points, and I think we're going to take this conversation offline here because I don't know that we're going to resolve it here. But let's take note and follow back up with you with the right folks. So
yeah, that's fine, Margie, and Dave, and you all have been always very open and talking to me about this. It's not a big deal. It just went by, and as I mentioned in my note, it doesn't have to be answered now, but it's just something I hope we keep thinking about.
Okay, great. Thank you. I see Chris Hickman and Steve Fishman have your hands up. We're going to ask Ben to go through this next scenario and then take all questions on both of these demand side scenarios together to make sure that we get time for the presentation. And so Ben, please go ahead and leave your hands up if you remain having questions, and we'll come back, get as many as we can still today.
Perfect. Thank you, Margie. So now we're going to go into the residential demand side solution scenario. As I mentioned, there's kind of two different components of this scenario. One is the DER enabled homes, and that is a combination of solar 8-hour battery energy storage. And that may be the confusion from earlier, the 8-hour batteries for this DER solution. And then also demand response. The way we are modeling this, as I've explained in prior meetings, is 2,500 homes per annum over a 10-year period. So from 2026 to 2035, after that time period, you would have 25,000 homes on the system. And then also there was a request to incorporate time of use rates into this analysis. And what we see here on the right-hand side is the impact of those time of use rates. So the base case is here in dark blue, and then the impact of implementing a shift in time of use rates is shown here in the orange. And when I say shift in, what I'm talking about is essentially you're moving demand from 1 hour into another hour, but you're not ultimately impacting annual demand. So annual demand stays the same. You're just literally just shifting it from one time period to another. But it is very impactful, because if we look at this modeling result, what we're looking at here is about a 200 megawatt, give or take, difference in the peak load in 2030 with and without the demand response. So before I kind of get onto that, let me just quickly give you some more details on the modeling inputs and assumptions. As I just mentioned, 2,500 homes beginning 26. Every 2,500 homes provides 32.5 megawatts of residential solar. I can't do the math in my head, but I believe that's a 13 kilowatt solar array. 30 megawatts of behind the meter 8-hour storage, and we're modeling this with a 91% round trip efficiency. And then also 35 megawatts of demand response. Again, we have assumed zero cost to implement these measures. So these are not cost savings, they are merely cost benefits. And then again, mentioning, the time of use rate shift loads from peak hours into non-peak hours, but there's no change in the total energy requirement over an annual basis. And then there's some additional assumptions here, and I'll move this back down before Chris tells me off. That we have a default opt-in time of use rates with 15% opt-out assumption, and then on-peak hourly usage decreases by 9.2%. I can't talk to these numbers. This came from EPE from a Barato study that was conducted. So if we have any questions on these two assumptions, I need to pass it over to EPE. Okay, and we are going to do some additional sensitivities, some additional kind of stress test analyses on this run. One is we're going to just do a sensitivity, and this isn't meant to be a kind of like a feasibility stress test. What we want to just do is see how it impacts the modeling results if we assume the demand side solutions are not available until 2030. Now, the only reason, I want to be very clear, the only reason we are doing that is because the alternative resources, supply side resources, cannot come into the model until 2030. So what we just want to make sure is none of the cost benefits that we're showing today are actually speed to market benefits, as opposed to like truly benefits compared to the alternative resources. Now, I want to be very clear, that's not saying there are not speed to market benefits, that absolutely are. We just want to make sure when we do these analyses, we're isolating different components so we understand why the modeling results are doing what they're doing. The other kind of sensitivity that I would like to do is to separate out the time of use rates separately from the DER components. So again, that's not saying that EP are going to make that decision. This is just trying to isolate the value streams. So we can look and say, hey, the time of use rates are doing this, the DERs individually are doing that, and combined, this is what's happening, right? And of course, what we don't want to do there is, for argument's sake, and I'm not saying this is true, but we do not want to model a combined scenario and find one of the components is providing 95% of the value, right? We want to understand where the value is coming from. And also on this initial modeling run, again, just to keep things simple, make sure we're QA and QC and we understand how things are moving. We have exactly the same amount of energy consumption in both the least cost plus REA case versus the change case or the DER case. So if you do see energy efficiency savings on a system-wide basis by having DERs, those savings would be incremental to what we're showing today. Okay, so let's first look, again, looking at this chart where we see what's happening to resource build. So when we look at what's happening to resource build, there's a few things that happen in here. Is we're seeing fewer gas CTs being built or gas generation being built. And that kind of totals around about 200 megawatts. So the total contribution of this DER program would essentially be avoiding something like an F-class frame CT, which typically has a maximum output in the 200 megawatt range. We also see a significant decrease in 4-hour battery energy storage being added to the system, somewhere in the region of maybe 300 to 400 megawatts. We'll see on the next slide. And then there's also less supply side solar generation coming into the expansion plans. Now, just to be real clear though, this graph does not include the additional demand side solar 8-hour storage and demand response. So what we're essentially saying is some of the supply side solar is obviously being replaced with DER solar, and then some of the dispatchable resources, the 4-hour batteries, the gas generation is essentially being replaced by either the DERs or the time of use rates. And that's why I want to do that kind of separate analysis so we can see what's driving what. So if we look here now on a nameplate basis, if you recall, in most of the other charts that we've looked at today, these two bar charts have been pretty similar in size, right? Now, there's two things that are driving this difference. One is, again, this is just the system, new supply side resources. So you need fewer supply side resources because you have DER resources coming online. And then also you have fewer resources needed because you've essentially shifted some of that peak demand into non-peak hours. So you have less of a resource need. So if we're going to just pause here a moment and start looking at these numbers because they're relatively large numbers. If we look over the total planning horizon, there's really no impact to wind generation. Not really surprising, right? There's really little incremental winds being added to the least cost plus REA case, adding a bunch of solar, time of use rates, DERs didn't really increase the wind resources being selected. What we do though see is this 200 megawatts less of gas generation. So keep in mind that we're implementing this system evenly across Texas and New Mexico. So that's why you're seeing a benefit or a reduction on the Texas side as well. And then you're seeing a pretty significant decrease in the amount of solar and battery energy storage on a nameplate basis. And again, I want to be very clear here, this isn't necessarily a reduction in solar and storage. What it really is a reduction of supply side utility scale resources somewhat replaced with DERs. So in fact, actually, if we go back a few slides, we can see on this graph that you're looking at adding by 2035, you're looking at adding 600 megawatts of batteries and solar DERs. And then on this side, you're looking at saving 900 to 1,000 megawatts, of solar and storage resources. So why the big difference between supply side and demand side? These are 8-hour batteries. The supply side ones are 4-hour batteries. So that's why you see more resource savings. If we look on the New Mexico system here, similar sort of story. Obviously, there's no gas generation in New Mexico. So what you see is a significant reduction in battery energy storage, and the battery energy storage is being reduced proportionately because these are longer duration battery. And then if we look here on an accredited capacity basis, this is again another reason why I want to break out the time of use from the DERs. What you see here is the incremental DER value from the ELCC value from the DERs, excuse me. So you see it just starting here, it kind of ramps up as you continue to add more resources to the system, and then it flattens out. If you recall, in almost all of the other slides that we've looked at, you've seen an opposite reaction, right? So you've seen the same amount of resources on the negative side, where you end up having them being net zero or a wash. The reason here you see significantly fewer accredited capacity resources being added is because of the time of rates component, time of use rates component. You are shifting the peak, and you're shifting some of the hours from the peak to non-peak, so therefore you need less accredited capacity. So this one, we're kind of seeing two different things happening, which makes it a little bit more difficult or challenging to look up. Here, again, similar sort of chart, but just presented differently. We see, if we look at it on accredited capacity, the difference between the height of these two charts is approximately 200 megawatts, give or take. And that 200 megawatts, let's go back, is shown right here. So you have 200 megawatts, give or take, less demand. So that's why you see fewer resources being added in the case where you have the DER and the time of use rates. And then you'll see in green here in turquoise, it's a little bit hard to see, but the additional value of the demand response component. So all in all, from an accredited capacity perspective, you're seeing approximately 200-ish megawatts of less capacity, accredited capacity provided. That aligns with the time of use rates benefit. You see additional demand response benefits here, which is because you're adding additional DR with the DNR neighborhood homes. And you see less gas generation, approximately, as I mentioned earlier, 200-ish megawatts over the time period. And then you see fewer solar and storage resources being added. Just know that I believe actually some of the resources may be embedded within here. Some of the DR ones I need to check. And then we see this on a New Mexico only portion. Again, no gas here, but you see fewer solar and storage resources being added. So reducing that overbuild to meet the RPS requirements. And instead, you're seeing additional demand response benefits, reducing that capacity need. I don't really know where to go on this one. There's a lot going on this chart. This one may have stumped me, but this is showing the energy requirements with and without the demand, the DRs, excuse me. You can see it's kind of a little bit overboard or all over the place here. So let's maybe just try and extract some themes as opposed to concentrate on individual values. I would say, generally speaking, you're seeing more generation from solar resources, from the DERs, more storage discharge, and then for the most part, less reliance upon gas-fired CTs. So there's some kind of weird nuances year from year, just as resource timing changes. You know, in the base case, maybe you build a CT, in the change case, maybe you build it 2 years later, which causes some of these annual changes here. But overall, you can kind of see some patterns emerging. And then finally, if we look at the cost savings here, now again, to Cynthia's point earlier, these are just the cost savings that we're capturing in Plexos. So these are avoided energy, avoided capacity that's being captured, The capacity factors from solar resources are being grossed up to take into account transmission and distribution line losses, so that is captured in. I also want to be very clear that flattening the load profile or flattening the peak is embedded within these Plexus models. That is not an incremental benefit. But certain incremental benefits, such as, it's to Cynthia's point earlier, avoided emissions would be an incremental benefit. Additional or avoided deferred transmission distribution build out would be another example of benefits that are not captured in this analysis. But what we see here is obviously we've still got a few more years of ramping up here through 2035. So in this period, when you're continuing to add 2,500 homes per year, you see savings going from approximately 100, or benefits going from 150 to $200 million a year. And then once you've got to kind of full implementation stage in 2035, you kind of align around about $200 million nominal benefits per year. I have previously conducted similar analyses that does not include the time of use rates. And I would say these results are pretty close, if I'm honest with you. But until I separate out the time of use rates from the DERs, I won't be able to give you kind of that exact comparison. So Cynthia, I went through that. Margie, I went through that extremely quickly because I want to give people time for questions. So I'll pause there and see what questions we have.
Yeah, you want to review your takeaways, Ben.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Margie. So just repeating what I just said. So combination of significant additions of DERs, residential solar, 8-hour storage, demand response, and time of use rates significantly reduces the amount of alternative supply side resources that are needed. Significantly, it does reduce natural gas builds across the system, so aim for the Texas piece. And then for New Mexico, it also reduces the amount of supply side batteries and 4-hour energy storage resources that you need. Next steps will be to break out the DERs from the time of use rates, just so we can isolate individual value streams, as well as conducting those other two analyses where we look at a 2030 implementation and just make sure that we're kind of looking at it from an apples to apples basis, so we can isolate those value streams, and also increase those potential energy efficiency system savings. Without those changes, right now you see $150 million of nominal savings in 2030. That increases approximately linearly to 200 million once fully implemented in 2035, and then stays constant about $200 million a year in 2035 to 2045. So I will pause now, Margie, and open it up for questions.
Thanks, Ben. I see hands up by Steve Fishman and Chris Hickman, and then after those two, I'll ask Ben. And it looks, I don't know if I'll ask after those two questions. I'm going to have you and Emmanuel describe what you have to do next and what people can look forward to hearing about at the next workshop. And so please, Steve, go ahead. Then Chris, and I think Cynthia has her hands up, perhaps with a question, but Chris, go ahead.
So Ben, if you wouldn't mind, just flip back to slide 39. Sorry to make you go so far.
Okay.
So just to make this more consistent with each one of the cases, you go through this, but your last bullet for the cumulative and net present value, can you guys just make that consistent with all the cases? So all of them are saying having the same metrics on the slide, because in all the other cases, Eddy County, or sorry, this is Eddy County. Sorry, for all the rest of the cases, just having the same kind of summary information on each slide. Thank you.
Absolutely, Chris. And Chris, I'll give you one guess at what the very last slides we were putting together an hour before this meeting were. They were the system cost ones. So yeah, there was no intention to avoid information here. It was just a time.
No. I completely understand. I'm just saying, just for consistency, it'd be nice to update what's all there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Chris. Steve, did you have a question?
Well, I sent a written comment saying, boy, it's, there's this kind of conflict between meeting the RPS and what demand side might do, at least in terms of timing. And, I think it would be real interesting to look at the measures. I mean, I can imagine circumstances where if I were on the commission still, I might say, gee, I'm willing to sacrifice RPS, meeting the RPS to get demand in, particularly if I could run a carbon measure that is essentially equivalent or better if I did the demand management side investment. So anyway, it creates all kinds of questions for me in terms of the criteria we apply to evaluating the demand side measures and their overall value. So anyway, I'm just trying to think through that conundrum and thought I'd throw it out there.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Ben, any response?
The only point of clarification here, and I don't think this is what Steve was intending, but just to confirm, all of these portfolios do meet the RPS requirements. So even the portfolios where we have demand response, DERs, they all meet the REA requirements. And we are assuming, of course, that the DERs do also conform with the RPS for the solar resources, of course, the residential solar.
Right, because I think that is one of the requirements for system requirements is to meet the RPS. I don't think there's an option to not meet them, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah, it has to. The way it's doing it, though, and I think this is to Steve's point, and Steve, please correct me if I'm wrong here, is in order to conform with two different requirements, one being system reliability, plan and reserve margin requirements, another being RPS. What it actually is doing is it's far exceeding the RPS. That is not the binding constraint. The binding constraint is to meet your plan and reserve margin requirements while also conforming to the RPS. Just means you have to build an extraordinary amount of wind, solar, and batteries, and that becomes expensive. And that's why the DRs are kind of reducing those resources.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I see we have several more hands up, and it's 3:50. So what I would like to ask, Kathy, unless you have a different suggestion, is that those of you with your hands up, please type your notes, your question into the chat. We are going to tell you what happens next. And it looks like we might want to schedule an office hour to answer residual questions that are remaining, and also giving you all a chance to digest this very deep and intense information you've received today. So please type your questions into the chat. I'm going to go through what happens next, and if we have time, we'll come back to the questions that are still in the chat from this workshop. So Ben, Emmanuel, Rhonda, folks, thank you for that presentation. It sounds like in addition to the carbon cost integration scenario that you have yet to do, and the post analyses, of course, will happen after the rest of the modeling in the gray boxes that you showed in the format in the hierarchy. So looks like the team has some more work to do before the next workshop. But thank you for everything that you all have done over the past month and continue to shed light on this very complex situation. Let me ask, Kathy, do you have anything to add before I tell people what happens next?
Nope, go ahead, and I'm tracking in the chat.
Great, thank you. Deb, would you please share slide number 9? Yes. So let me just recap, because some folks, so we honor people's time here. We are planning for the 7th workshop on July 1st in the afternoon. Of course, from what I hear today, we will schedule an office hour or more to answer residual questions, and we'll try to figure out how to do that, perhaps topically or perhaps based on interest. I don't know how we're going to do that yet. We will use the chat information to structure that. There will be one another workshop on the 8th, on July 24th. And that is going to be a combination of in-person and hybrid Zoom. We are strongly recommending, if people can, to attend that in person. That will be our last working workshop to finalize input to the statement of need and the action plan. So that will happen. We're also got one more thing on the schedule after the IRP is submitted on September 1st. GridWorks will host a session to get feedback from all stakeholders on how did this process work for you and what you would suggest be improved in the future. So please put those dates on your calendars. And Deb, the next slide then shows some other things that are going to happen. The materials, including this recording, will be on the GridWorks website shortly. We'll send out a summary, all of you, by June 20th. We have some action items on things that people have requested that we post, and we will do that. We've also heard some suggestions on a collaborative discussion regarding the RFP that has been proposed, or the notice of material event, and the filing by EPE. So we'll take that into consideration. We are going to ask for your feedback on things that you think should go into the action plan. And if you get a chance to review slide 11 from Emmanuel's presentation today, you will see that EPE has put some starting ideas and thoughts into an action plan list. We will be asking for your input within a week, and so that we can use both your stakeholder input and EPE's input to jumpstart our conversation at workshop number 7 on what should go into the action plan. So please consider joining us in Las Cruces on the 24th. Please put July 1st on your schedule for a virtual workshop. And I think at this point, we do have a little bit of time for questions, but let me first, before we do that, go to Emmanuel or Judy or Dave to see if there's anything from EPE that you would like to say before we close with some more questions.
From our side, again, just as always, thank you everyone for your participation. I think it'll be helpful if we can try to get as many of your questions before we schedule the next office hour. That way it'll be more efficient and we can try to address everything. So we'll work with GridWorks on how to collect all of your questions and structure something around that. I think the DER discussion might be its own office hour, and then it seems like we can cover the other ones in a separate office hour discussion. I know the DER seems to be the big one here. We want to give it the appropriate amount of time. But other than that, there's nothing else from me, if anybody.
Okay, great. Thank you, Emmanuel. For those who have to go, feel free. The rest of us, we will stay on here to answer some questions if people have time. I see that Cynthia Mitchell, I think you had your hand up first. Would you please go ahead with your question?
Okay, thank you. And I was just typing it in the chat.
Okay.
The residential base case, or the residential DER case, seems very positive. If we say look at slide 58, it seems to indicate by 2035 that you might be able to defer 900 plus megawatts of gas, solar, and battery storage, if I'm looking at that correctly. So I'm just wondering if you are at the, Emmanuel and Judith, if you all are at the point now with the DER analysis, including the CNI, to feel comfortable enough to go back and revise your base case. For instance, if we were to look at slide 18, and we were to see that in 2035, you were going to have 1,300 megawatts of new gas. What if you had a 500 megawatt block of DER in your base case instead, and that reduced that amount of gas. And so that's the sort of analysis that I think staff has said that we were interested in from the very start. Great to have this stakeholder scenario analysis here, but let's see it impact your base case directly and view that DER resource as a, somewhat generic resource that you're essentially going to go out and acquire, maybe not so much in an RFP resource, but like an RFP process. You're going to go out and make it happen, one way or the other. Are you feeling confident like that now?
All right. Several questions in there.
I know.
But we definitely want to follow up with you because we are liking the direction that this discussion is going. So we've talked about that on the side. So we will be following up. I can ask Ben or Dave to jump in here if I misspeak, but in terms of incorporating this into the base case, I think just from a modeling perspective, that doesn't quite make sense because you need the base case to be as it is today so that you can reflect what changes you're going to be proposing for your statement of need or your action plan.
Okay, well, but then I guess what I'm saying, fine to have the base case you have, though, I still want some adjustments to that, okay? To more reasonably reflect some of the costs and such that we're talking about. But then are you willing then to say, here's a alternative DER base case, and this is what from an action plan basis we want to go after? Is that what you're saying more closely?
Can I? Sorry, Manu, I didn't mean to speak over you, but I think we're maybe mixing terminology here, and maybe it's getting lost in translation. To me, the base case isn't the preferred case, right? And I think what the IRP should be built off would be a preferred case. So to Manuel's point, from a modeling mechanics perspective, you start with the base case, which is kind of system as it stands today. What would the model do just based on a narrow set of inputs and assumptions? And then you do test cases through scenarios and sensitivities. And once you're done with that modeling exercise, you end up with a preferred plan or a preferred portfolio. And that to me is what you build the statement of need and action plan over. So I don't see the need of having to incorporate this into the base case per se. I think, Cynthia, what you're really asking, okay.
What, Ben, somewhere along the line, I lost the thread that there was going to be a preferred case that hopefully, in my viewpoint, differed from your base case, okay?
Yeah, just to be clear, and I think, to be honest, Cynthia, you didn't hear preferred case because I probably just made that up on the spot. But just to be clear, the modeling shouldn't just be the base case is the final results, right? That's what I'm trying to get at.
And what I'm after is, or I think, well, and I know Ed is after this also. We just talked this morning, and we talked a day ago, a couple of days ago. He's interested in a preferred case that has significant DER, and I'm hoping that you all are feeling confident enough now with some of these modeling results to view it as a somewhat generic block, of resource, and that then through our action plan and ongoing stakeholder process, we'll go get it.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. I think we're going to take one more question, and thanks for putting any of your other comments in the chat. We'll record the last person I have here with hand up is, go ahead, Glenn, and then everyone else, as we're closing after Glenn's comment, please feel free to add your comments and questions into the chat. We may ask for those in another format, but since we have you all here and it's fresh on your minds, please put those into the chat. Glenn, please go ahead with the final question from today's workshop.
Right. I realized I used the wrong term when I asked the question about adequacy, and Ben kind of hinted at what I was really wanting to ask, which is a reliability analysis. And the way P&M does their IRP modeling, they'll go and they'll run a SERVM, I don't know what to call that kind of simulation, but let's call it a reliability simulation. Once they're reasonably clear that they like a particular portfolio that came out of the optimization, the capacity optimization phase. And I'm thinking that that's going to tell you how much you're going to rely on the Texas side of the system to meet your reliability requirement. And when you do that, then the energy mix could potentially change. And would you still be satisfying the RPS? Although it looked like you were way beyond satisfying the RPS many years. But does that make sense? Do you do that? And would you be able to know what's coming across the state line?
So, Glenn, everything up to the point of separating out Texas and New Mexico makes total sense to me. And just to be clear, that is exactly what we have done for EPE. So, SERVM is a competitor of ours, so I won't say anything there. But we did exactly the same loss of load probability type modeling. And we also did effective load carrying capability analyses to calculate the reliability contribution on a system-wide basis. What we haven't done, and I would have to kind of go away and think about the dynamics here, is then kind of islanded the two systems and done some sort of additional reliability analysis. Everything we've done has been on a kind of a system-wide basis at this point.
Well, when you do that loss of load in ELCC simulation, isn't that used to provide the inputs that go into the capacity optimization, capacity expansion optimization, or do you run it on a portfolio that came out of the capacity optimization?
Yeah, so typically what you do is you run it as an input with various different penetrations of resources.
Yeah.
And then after the fact, Glenn, what you typically do is you then run it through the capacity expansion and production cost modeling. And obviously it's going to meet the plan and reserve margin requirements. That's a requirement of the model. But typically you assign a very high cost to what they call EUE, which is expected unserved energy. So if on an hourly basis, there are periods in which you are energy deficient, not capacity deficient, then there will be a penalty assigned to such that the model will essentially build new resources above and beyond the plan and reserve margin requirement to meet energy adequacy. I am happy to spend many hours discussing this, Margie. I don't know if this is maybe good office hours topic.
Yeah, fine. Right,
Great.
yeah, because your approach is maybe a little different than what PNM is doing, and I'm trying to reconcile the two. So yeah, we can do that in office hours. One quick comment is I saw something
Glenn?
about 95% carbon capture on one of the slides, and as best I know, that is not compliant with the ETA. So hopefully that wasn't something that was going to be done in New Mexico.
Yeah, so that's a great point, right? Is at the moment carbon capture is not you just don't get 100% carbon capture out there. So that's a scenario we can obviously look at, and then you are going to have some leakage that's not going to conform, or you could look at 100% hydrogen fueled, and that has its own feasibility challenges. So just to be real clear, Glenn, when we look at, and this kind of goes to Cynthia's question she raised, when we look at these emerging technology scenarios, we can obviously look at them from a cost perspective. How does it impact the scenario? What are the likely changes to capacity and energy additions? But there's still feasibility questions that we also need to address, right?
And compliance issues. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Glenn, for the comments and questions. Thank you, Ben, Emmanuel, and David for the responses to all the questions. And we will close the workshop. We will leave the chat open here in case people want to add their additional questions for follow-up. We appreciate them very much, and you will be seeing a summary. We will also email you with our plan for scheduling those office hours and a request for input to action plan ideas. So with that, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you virtually on July 1st, which is 2 weeks from today, and July 24th in Las Cruces. Thank you.